Eleanor Whitmore slammed the letter against Samuel Brooks's chest so hard, the old foreman stumbled backward into the porch railing of Iron Creek Ranch. 23 days on the road. Every cent she had spent. Every mile across a continent she had never crossed before. Alone, heavy with exhaustion, and with everything the world had ever said about a woman built the way she was built. And now this man was standing in front of her, telling her the job had never existed. "Read it," she said. Her voice did not shake. "Read every single word you wrote to me." Samuel's face went the color of old ash. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I can explain." "You sent this letter to Boston," she said. "I sold my father's books to buy the stage ticket. I survived a coach accident in the middle of nowhere. I arrived here with 50 cents in my purse and a broken trunk, and you are going to stand there and tell me—" "The letter," Samuel said miserably, "was meant for a family in Laramie. The addresses got mixed up. The position. It's not here. It never was here." Eleanor stood absolutely still. She looked at the ranch behind him. The cattle on the slope. The smoke from the chimney of the main house. The barn. The fences. The whole of Iron Creek spread out around her like a world that had no place for her in it. She looked at the road she had come from. She had 50 cents. The stage was gone. Boston was 1,100 miles behind her. There was nowhere to go back to. She looked at Samuel Brooks. "Where," she said quietly, "is the man who owns this ranch?" That was the moment everything began. Not ended, not collapsed. Began. Because Eleanor Whitmore had not crossed 1,100 miles and lost everything she had to turn around in the dust of a Wyoming ranch and go back to a city that had already decided who she was. She was going to walk through that door. And nothing. Not a mistaken letter, not a man who hadn't hired her, not a territory full of people who would look at her full, heavy figure and decide in the first 2 seconds what she was worth. Nothing was going to stop her from building something on the other side of it. This is her story. Stay with me until the very last word. Because I promise you, it goes places you do not expect. If you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And drop the name of your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see exactly how far Eleanor's story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The stagecoach door opened, and Eleanor Whitmore stepped out onto Wyoming soil for the first time in her life. She had been traveling for 23 days. 23 days of rattling wooden benches that bruised her hips straight down to the bone. 23 days of sleeping upright with her trunk wedged between her knees because she did not trust the strangers beside her. 23 days of eating dried cornbread and salt pork at relay stations where the men behind the counters looked at her once, took in the full, heavy sweep of her figure, and turned away without smiling. She was used to that look. She had been collecting it since she was 12 years old. Eleanor was 25 now. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and carried a body that the world had spent 2 decades telling her was too much, too wide, too heavy, too soft for beauty, and too large for grace. She had heard every word that could be said about a woman built the way she was built, and she had learned, slowly and at great cost, to let those words pass through her the way wind passes through fence posts, loud for a moment, then gone. What the world could not take from her was her mind. She could read a ledger in half the time it took most men to find their spectacles. She could organize a household the way a general organizes a campaign, quietly, thoroughly, and without waste. She had managed her father's accounting office from the age of 16, and by the time she was 20, half the merchants on Boylston Street in Boston had come to rely on her more than they ever admitted out loud. None of that mattered to a world that looked at her and decided everything it needed to know before she opened her mouth. But Wyoming was supposed to be different. Wyoming was supposed to be the place where a woman's hands mattered more than her dress size. She had believed that. She had let herself believe it with a desperation that frightened her now, standing in the dust outside a small relay station at the edge of Iron Creek territory, holding a letter that had promised her steady wages, honest work, and a roof over her head. The letter was from Iron Creek Ranch. It had arrived at her cousin's boarding house in Boston 8 weeks ago, tucked inside an envelope with a Wyoming territory postmark. It was addressed to an Eleanor, not specifically to Eleanor Whitmore, but close enough that her cousin had handed it over without question. The letter offered the position of cook and housekeeper at a working cattle ranch. $30 a month, room and board included, with the possibility of advancement for a capable woman willing to work hard. Eleanor had read that letter 4 times before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. Then she had packed everything she owned into one trunk, sold the last of her father's books, and bought a stage ticket going west. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself it was survival. She had not told herself the whole truth, which was that she was running. Running from a city that looked at her and saw failure. Running from the house where her father had died in a back room while the creditors knocked at the front door. Running from the man she had almost loved, a bookkeeper named Gerald Fairbanks, who had smiled at her for 3 months and then told her, with the gentleness of a man who thought gentleness excused everything, that he could not see a future with a woman of her particular constitution. That was how he had said it. A woman of your particular constitution. Eleanor had thanked him for his honesty, walked out of his office, gone home, sat down in her father's chair, and cried for 2 hours straight. Then she had gotten up, washed her face, and started making a plan. Wyoming was the plan. Iron Creek Ranch was the plan. And now she was standing in the dust outside a relay station with a broken trunk latch, a pocket watch that had belonged to her father, and absolutely no idea whether the plan had survived the journey. She had wired ahead from Cheyenne. No response had come. She had asked the station master at the last stop if he knew Iron Creek Ranch. He had nodded slowly and told her it was about 4 miles east, that the owner was a man named Carter, and that Carter was a fair man if a hard one. He had not looked at her twice. She had been grateful for that. She hired a ranch hand with a wagon to take her and her trunk the 4 miles. He had looked at her the way they all looked. She had given him 50 cents and stared straight ahead the entire ride. The ranch came into view just after noon. It was larger than she had expected, with a main house set back from the road and a cluster of outbuildings. A bunkhouse, a barn, 2 smaller structures she could not immediately identify. Cattle grazed on the far slope. She could hear men working somewhere behind the barn, the sound of hammers and low voices carrying across the open air. The wagon stopped at the gate. Eleanor climbed down without waiting for help. She had stopped waiting for help a long time ago. She lifted her trunk with both hands, set it on the ground, and straightened up. An older man was walking toward her from the direction of the barn. He was somewhere around 60, with a sun-creased face and a walk that spoke of 40 years in the saddle. He was wearing a canvas work jacket and a hat that had been through weather she could only imagine. He stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You Miss Whitmore?" he said. "I am," she said. "And you must be Samuel Brooks. I received your letter." Something shifted in this man's face. It was brief, a flinch almost, quickly covered. But Eleanor had spent her whole life reading the small movements of people's faces, and she caught it clean. "My letter," he said slowly. "Yes." She reached into the front pocket of her traveling coat and produced the envelope. "The letter offering me the position of cook and housekeeper at Iron Creek Ranch. $30 a month, room and board included." She held it out to him. "I trust there has been no change to the terms." Samuel Brooks did not take the letter. He took off his hat instead and pressed it to his chest, and the expression that moved across his face then was one she recognized immediately because she had seen it before on the faces of men who were about to say something they knew was going to cause damage. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I don't rightly know how to tell you this." "Tell me plainly," she said. "I traveled 23 days for plain answers." He looked at the ground. He looked at the hat in his hands. He looked at the barn behind him. He looked everywhere except at her face. "That letter," he said at last. "It was meant for a different household. I had been corresponding with the placement agency back east on behalf of a family in Laramie. The Hendersons. They needed a cook. I must have... The addresses got mixed up somehow and..." He stopped. He still could not look at her. "Are you telling me?" Eleanor said, and her voice was very quiet now, very controlled, the way it got when she was holding something large and sharp inside her chest. That the position offered in this letter does not exist at this ranch? Yes, ma'am, he said. I'm real sorry. I can't tell you how sorry I am. If I had known... The position, she said again, cutting him off cleanly, does not exist. No, ma'am, it doesn't. The silence between them lasted long enough for a hawk to pass overhead and disappear over the barn roof. Eleanor looked at her trunk on the ground. She looked at the wagon disappearing back down the road. She looked at the ranch spread out around her, the cattle on the slope, the half-built fence line, the smoke coming from the main house chimney. She looked at Samuel Brooks, who was still examining his hat. "Where is the owner?" she asked. "Mr. Carter is in the main house," Samuel said. "But miss, I don't think it would be wise to—" "Take me to him," she said. Samuel opened his mouth. "Mr. Brooks," she said, before he could speak, "I left everything I had in Boston. I have 50 cents in my purse, a broken trunk latch, and 23 days of road dust on my coat. I am not getting back on a stage today. Take me to the man who runs this ranch." Samuel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Yes, ma'am," and walked her to the main house. Nathaniel Carter was at his desk when they came in. He was younger than she had expected, 38 perhaps, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of lean, sun-weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. He was not a large man, but he held himself the way large men often did, with a stillness that took up space. He had papers spread across the desk in front of him and was frowning at something in the top corner of one of them when Samuel opened the door. He looked up. His eyes went to Samuel first, then to Eleanor. She watched the same thing happen that always happened. The quick, involuntary sweep of assessment. The taking in of her size, her shape, the full round weight of her against the doorframe. Then the slightly too careful neutrality that men adopted when they were trying not to show what they had just thought. She had seen it 10,000 times. It never stopped costing something, but she had learned to pay the cost without showing it on her face. "Mr. Carter," Samuel said, "this is Miss Whitmore. There's been a situation with the letter." Nathaniel Carter set down his pen. "What letter?" "The one I sent by mistake," Samuel said. He had gone slightly red about the ears. "To Boston. The position for the Henderson family." A pause. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor again. "You came from Boston?" he said. "Yes," she said. "On account of a letter from this ranch?" "On account of a letter offering me a position at this ranch, yes." He leaned back in his chair. He was thinking. She could see him doing it. The steady, methodical quality of his attention told her he was not a man who moved fast on the inside, whatever his face did on the outside. "How long ago did you leave?" he asked. 23 days. "And you wired ahead?" "From Cheyenne." No response came. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at Samuel, who was now studying the floorboards. "Sam," he said quietly. "I know it," Samuel said. "I know it, Nate. I'm sorry." Nathaniel Carter looked at Eleanor. He looked at her for a long time without saying anything, with the kind of focused attention that most people reserved for problems they were actually trying to solve, rather than people they were trying to dismiss. Then he said, "What are your qualifications?" Eleanor blinked. Just once. It was the last thing she had expected him to say. "For what position?" she asked. "Any position," he said. "You're here. You've got 23 days of road behind you and 50 cents to your name, unless Sam's guess is wrong. Tell me what you can do." She straightened. "I managed my father's accounting office for 9 years. I can keep books, track inventory, identify waste in a budget, and reorganize a financial system that has gone off course. I can cook for large numbers. I have managed household kitchens serving 12 or more. I can organize a supply schedule, negotiate with vendors, and identify when someone is taking financial advantage of an operation that does not have time to watch its own numbers." Nathaniel Carter had not moved. "Can you identify it fast?" he said. "I spotted 3 irregularities in the ledger on your desk from where I'm standing," she said. He turned and looked at the ledger. He looked back at her. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," he said. She pulled out the chair across from him. settled her weight into it with the practiced economy of movement that kept strangers from having the satisfaction of watching her struggle, and folded her hands on the edge of his desk. "Show me," he said, and turned the ledger toward her. She showed him. The first irregularity was in the feed supply column, a recurring charge from a vendor in Cheyenne that was running 12% above the regional average for the same goods, compounding monthly since March, which meant the ranch had been losing approximately $48 over the last 6 months to a supplier who was simply charging what he could get away with because nobody had been watching closely enough. The second was a payroll entry listed twice in the same week with slightly different handwriting. Not necessarily fraud, but careless. And carelessness with numbers always cost you eventually. The third was a pattern in the cattle auction records where the lowest bid prices all clustered around a single buyer's name, which told her either the buyer was very lucky or the ranch's negotiating position at market was weaker than it should be. She explained all three in less than 10 minutes. Nathaniel Carter sat across from her and listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long would it take you to go through the full ledger?" he said. 1 week for a preliminary review, 2 weeks for a complete audit with recommendations. He nodded slowly. "I need to be clear about something," she said. "I am not asking for charity, Mr. Carter. I am telling you that I have specific skills that your operation appears to need, and I am willing to apply them in exchange for fair wages and accommodation. Whatever happened with the letter, the work I am describing is real, and the problems I have just identified are real. If you cannot use what I have to offer, I understand. But I am not in a position to get back on a stage today, and I am not asking you to feel sorry for me." He looked at her for another long moment. "The guest room off the kitchen," he said at last. "You can have it while we sort this out. Sam will see your trunk brought in." He paused. "Supper's at 6. After supper, we'll talk wages." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you," she said. She stood, buttoned her traveling coat over her chest, and walked out of his office with her back straight and her face composed and her hands perfectly steady. She did not cry until she was alone in the guest room with the door latched behind her, and even then, it was quick. 2 minutes, no more, with her hand pressed over her mouth and her father's watch in her other hand. She thought about him. She thought about his study in Boston and the smell of pipe tobacco and ledger ink. She thought about the way he used to say, "Eleanor, you have a mind like a surgeon's kit. Every tool in its place, and none of them wasted." She believed he would have been proud of today. She wiped her face. She unpacked her trunk. By 5:30 she was in the kitchen, had assessed the entire larder, identified which supplies were low, and had started a stock of beef broth from the bone ends she found at the back of the cold box that otherwise would have gone to waste. The ranch cook, an older Mexican man named Rodrigo, who had been with Iron Creek for 12 years, came in at 5:45, stopped in the doorway, and stared at her. "Who let you in my kitchen?" he said. "I let myself in," Eleanor said. "I found your bone ends. You were going to discard them." "I was going to use them tomorrow." "The broth will be better if it simmers overnight," she said. "It will save you an hour tomorrow morning, and the flavor will be stronger." She paused. "I apologize for coming into your space without asking. I should have waited for an introduction." Rodrigo looked at the pot. He looked at her. He looked at the pot again. "You know how to cook?" he said. "I have been feeding people since I was 16, she said. He pulled out a chair, sat down, crossed his arms, and said, "Make the cornbread then. Let's see what you know." She made the cornbread. At supper that evening, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, who could not have been more than 20, and who wore his opinions on his face the way some men wore their hats, too loose and too obvious, took one look at Eleanor seated at the end of the long table and said, just loud enough to carry, "What's she doing in here? She one of the cook's relatives?" The table went quiet. Nathaniel Carter, at the head, put down his fork and looked at Pete. "She is a guest of this ranch," Nathaniel said. His voice was level and had no emotion in it whatsoever, which Eleanor was coming to understand was more dangerous than raised voices. "You'll address her by name or not at all. Her name is Miss Whitmore." Pete's ears went red. "Yes, sir," he muttered. The table returned to its meals. Eleanor ate her supper without looking up. After supper, when the hands had cleared out and Rodrigo had gone back to his quarters, Nathaniel poured 2 cups of coffee and set one across the table from where he sat. $30 a month, he said. Same as the letter offered. Room and board. You audit the books, you help Rodrigo when he needs it, and you give me a full report at the end of 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks? She asked. We see what the report says, he said. That's fair, she said. She picked up the coffee cup. Miss Whitmore, he said. She looked at him. What Pete said at supper, he said. That's not going to be the last time something like that happens. I want you to know that ahead of time. These men aren't bad, most of them. But they're not accustomed to a woman in the operation, and some of them will say things. I know, she said. I'll deal with it when it happens, he said. But I want you to know you don't have to handle it alone. She looked at him carefully. He meant it. She could see it. That same steady, methodical quality in his attention, the absence of performance in his words. He was not trying to impress her. He was not offering comfort to make himself feel better. He was simply stating a fact. I appreciate that, she said. She meant it too. The first week was hard in the ways she had expected and hard in ways she hadn't. The expected difficulty was the physical labor. Ranch life at Iron Creek ran from before sunrise to after dark, and the work did not pause for weather or mood or the protest of muscles that had spent 3 weeks locked in a stagecoach seat. Eleanor was not fragile. She had never been fragile, whatever people assumed about a woman her size. But she was out of her element in the way that all capable people are out of their element when the setting changes faster than the body can follow. She woke before 5 every morning and was in the kitchen by 1:30, helping Rodrigo with breakfast for 14 men. The standing wore on her feet, and the lifting wore on her back, and the heat from the stove wore on everything else. But she did not complain, and she did not slow down, and by the 4th day, Rodrigo had stopped hovering and watching, and had simply started working alongside her the way he worked alongside his own rhythms, easy and without ceremony. The unexpected difficulty was the ledger. Not because the work itself was difficult. The work was familiar. Numbers were always familiar. The particular language of them. The way they told the truth even when the people recording them were trying to hide something. The difficulty was what the numbers were saying. By the end of the 3rd day, Eleanor had a very clear picture of Iron Creek Ranch's financial situation. And the picture was not good. The vendor overcharges she had spotted on day 1 were only the surface of it. Underneath, there was a pattern of deferred maintenance expenses that had been allowed to accumulate until they were no longer deferrable. Fence line repairs, equipment replacement, structural work on the barn's east wall that had been pushed back season after season until the wood had gone soft enough that a hard winter could compromise the whole structure. And underneath that, there was the note. Iron Creek Ranch was carrying a significant loan from a bank in Cheyenne, a bank called Meridian Territorial, that was coming due in 7 months. The interest terms were not criminal, but they were not generous, and the current trajectory of the ranch's income, measured against its expenditures and that deferred maintenance burden, suggested that Nathaniel Carter was going to come up short at the due date by somewhere between $800 and $1,200. That was not a survivable shortfall for a cattle operation in the Wyoming Territory in 1875. Eleanor sat with that knowledge for an entire evening before she said anything. She was in the small room off the kitchen that had become her workspace. The guest room was for sleeping, but she had asked for a table and a lamp and spent her evenings there with the ledgers spread open and her own notebook filling up beside them. She sat with the numbers, and she thought about what it meant. It meant that Nathaniel Carter's ranch was not simply disorganized. It was in genuine danger. Not immediate, catastrophic, bank coming to seize the cattle danger, but the slower, quieter kind of danger that crept up on operations that had been running on momentum and hard work without adequate financial oversight. The kind of danger that her father's business had been in, 3 years before it finally collapsed. She had not caught it in time for her father. She was going to catch it here. On the 4th morning, she asked Nathaniel to sit down with her after breakfast. He came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat across from her at the kitchen table. Most of the hands had gone out to work. Rodrigo was washing pots. The morning was quiet. Eleanor opened her notebook to the page where she had written the summary. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it completely before you respond." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her. "Go ahead," she told him. She laid it out the way she would have laid it out for any client in Boston. Clearly, sequentially, without drama, but without softening. The vendor overcharges. The deferred maintenance. The loan from Meridian Territorial and the projected shortfall. The 7-month window. The numbers at every step. When she finished, Nathaniel Carter was quiet. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at the table. 7 months, he said. Approximately. The calculation depends on cattle prices at the fall auction, which I cannot predict. But the current trajectory gives you a window of approximately 7 months before the shortfall becomes critical. He was quiet again. She had learned already that this was not evasion, it was how he processed. She waited. "What would you do?" he said finally. "First, renegotiate with the vendor in Cheyenne. The overcharge is significant enough that you have grounds to demand a corrected rate retroactively for the last 6 months, which would recover approximately $40 and establish a fair baseline going forward. Second, prioritize the barn wall. The east section needs repair before winter, and delaying it further risks a structural failure that would cost 5 times what repair costs today. Third, the payroll discrepancy needs to be audited by hand against the work logs for the last 3 months. What about the loan? The loan is the hardest part, she said. The interest terms can be renegotiated if you approach Meridian with a documented improvement plan before the due date. Banks prefer renegotiation to default. If you walk in there with 3 months of corrected financial records and a clear remediation strategy, you have a better chance of extending the timeline than if you wait until you're 6 weeks out. He looked at her then. Looked at her directly, with that same focused attention she had noticed on the first day. "How long did it take you to see all of this?" he said. 3 days for the full picture, she said. "I had the vendor issue on the first day." "You knew this on the first day," he said slowly. "I knew one piece of it on the first day. The full picture took 3 days. He picked up his coffee cup again. He looked out the window for a moment. She could see him doing what he did. The methodical, unhurried work of taking something large in and deciding what to do with it. "All right," he said. "All right what?" she asked. "All right, do what you just described," he said. "Write me the letter to the Cheyenne vendor, make a list of what's needed for the barn wall, and give me the payroll audit in writing so I know what I'm looking at when I sit down with the work logs." She nodded. "I can have the vendor letter to you by this afternoon." "Do that," he said. He stood up, picked up his hat from where it was hanging by the door, and paused. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked up. "I've had a ranch foreman for 12 years, he said. "A good man. He works this land better than I do, but nobody has ever sat down and told me what you just told me." He paused. He looked like he was choosing his words with care. "I don't know if I should thank you or be angry at myself for not seeing it. You were busy keeping the ranch alive," she said. "The books fall behind when the hands are stretched thin. It's not a failure of character. It's what happens when one person is trying to do too many things." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he put on his hat and walked out. Eleanor looked down at her notebook. She thought about her father's business. She thought about the numbers she had watched deteriorate over 3 years, too slowly for her to name what she was seeing until it was already too late to name it. She picked up her pen. She started writing the letter to the vendor in Cheyenne. By the end of the first week, word had gotten around the bunkhouse that Nathaniel Carter had a woman from Boston doing something with the ranch books. The opinions were varied, and most of them arrived at Eleanor's ears secondhand through Rodrigo, who reported them with the impassive efficiency of a man who had seen enough in his life to find very little surprising. Pete had told anyone who would listen that it was embarrassing to have a fat city woman sitting in the house going through the boss's papers. 2 of the older hands, a man named Henry and another named Cole, had apparently said she would be gone inside a month once the Wyoming winter convinced her she was in the wrong country. A third man, a quiet one named James, who had been with the ranch since before Nathaniel inherited it from his father, had said nothing at all, which Rodrigo reported as probably the most respectful response available. Eleanor heard all of this and did what she always did with information of that kind. She filed it. She did not waste time on anger. Anger was a temperature she couldn't afford to run at indefinitely, and she had learned long ago that the only thing that answered that particular kind of contempt was results. Results were patient. Results accumulated. And when they arrived in a form that no one could argue with. She kept working. She finished the payroll audit on the 7th day and found 2 additional discrepancies, both minor, both attributable to poor record-keeping rather than any deliberate fraud, but correctable. She wrote them up with clear remediation steps and added them to the growing file of recommendations she was building for Nathaniel. She helped Rodrigo with meals. She learned the kitchen's rhythms and she adapted to them rather than imposing her own, because she understood that Rodrigo's kitchen had been his territory for 12 years and that territory deserved respect. He had started, by the end of the week, to teach her things. The particular way he seasoned the beans, the timing of the bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven, the adjustment for altitude that he'd worked out over years because the high Wyoming air behaved differently than any kitchen she had managed in Boston. She was a quick student. She always had been. On the 8th day, something happened that she had not anticipated. She was coming back from the supply shed after taking inventory of the non-perishable stores when she nearly collided with a woman she had never seen before. A slender, dark-haired woman, about her own age, carrying a covered dish and walking with the ease of someone who had made this walk before. They both stopped. Oh, the woman said. You must be the one from Boston. I am, Eleanor said. Eleanor Whitmore. Margaret Hayes, the woman said. She looked at Eleanor with open, uncomplicated curiosity. Not the kind that catalogued and judged, but the kind that was simply interested. I live on the neighboring property. I heard there was a woman out here, and I wanted to meet you. Eleanor blinked. You came to meet me? She said. Of course, Margaret said. Do you know how long I've been the only woman within 5 miles of this ranch? She held up the covered dish. I brought a pie. Apple. Let's go inside and you can tell me how on earth you ended up here. Eleanor looked at this woman, this direct, warm, completely unbothered woman, and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. I would like that very much, she said. Margaret Hayes turned out to be a widow. Her husband had died 2 years ago from a fever, leaving her with 40 acres, a small herd, and a stubbornness that had kept her from selling to any of the neighboring ranchers who had come offering what they felt was a reasonable price for a woman alone. She was 35, and she laughed easily, and she asked Eleanor questions, as though the answers genuinely mattered to her, which was the kind of attention Eleanor had not experienced from another woman in a very long time. They sat in the kitchen. Rodrigo had tactfully disappeared, and drank coffee and ate the apple pie, which was excellent. And Eleanor found herself talking in a way she had not talked to anyone in longer than she could precisely measure. She told Margaret about Boston, about her father and the business and the debts. She did not tell her about Gerald Fairbanks, but she told her enough of the shape of things that Margaret, who was perceptive, clearly understood. And you crossed all that way on the strength of one letter, Margaret said. On the strength of one letter, Eleanor confirmed. That either makes you incredibly brave or incredibly desperate, Margaret said. Both, Eleanor said. In equal measure. Margaret laughed. It was a good laugh, real and uncomplicated. I like you, Eleanor Whitmore, she said. I hope you stay. I hope so too, Eleanor said. And she meant it, which surprised her. Because somewhere in the 8 days she had been at Iron Creek Ranch, the answer to her own question had shifted. She had come here looking for a job. She was starting to understand she was looking for something else. She was looking for a place where the full weight of who she was, not just her mind, not just her skills, but all of it, the whole of her, could exist without apology. She did not know yet whether Wyoming could give her that. But she had stopped believing it couldn't. On the 9th day, Nathaniel Carter came back from Cheyenne with a written confirmation from the vendor acknowledging the overcharge and agreeing to a corrected rate going forward, along with a partial credit against the previous 6 months. It was $43.20. He walked into the kitchen where Eleanor was working with Rodrigo on dinner, set the paper on the table and said, $43. She looked up. That's slightly better than I projected. I told him you had documentation, Nathaniel said. He folded fast. They always do, she said, when there's documentation. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. Something she decided not to examine too closely, not yet. Good work, Miss Whitmore, he said. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she said. He picked up his hat and walked back out. Rodrigo, who had been stirring a pot with his back carefully turned during this exchange, said, without turning around, "He doesn't say that to many people." Say what? Eleanor asked. Good work, Rodrigo said. He kept stirring. Eleanor looked back down at the papers in front of her. She thought about the road behind her. 23 days of it, every rough and bruising mile. She thought about the letter that had brought her here under false pretenses, the job that had never existed, the moment she had stood in the dust outside this ranch with 50 cents and a broken trunk latch and nowhere to go back to. She thought about her father's watch in her coat pocket, ticking the way it always ticked, patient and steady and unmoved by circumstance. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The $43.20 changed something at Iron Creek Ranch, and Eleanor felt it before she could name it. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the quieter kind of change, the kind that moves through a working place, the way a shift in wind moves through dry grass, invisible until you notice that everything is leaning a different direction than it was before. The ranch hands noticed. They did not say anything directly to Eleanor, because most of them were not the kind of men who changed course out loud. But she watched the small adjustments happen around her over the days that followed Nathaniel's return from Cheyenne. Pete stopped making his comments at the supper table. Henry and Cole, who had given her the cold silence of men waiting for someone to fail, started meeting her eyes when she passed them in the yard. James, the quiet one who had said nothing from the beginning, nodded at her one morning when she carried the supply inventory out to the storage shed. A short, deliberate nod that meant more than a speech would have. She accepted all of it without comment. She was too busy to do otherwise. The 2-week deadline she had given Nathaniel was ticking, and the further she moved into the ranch's financial records, the more she found. Not catastrophe. Nothing she had not already accounted for in her summary. But the kind of accumulated neglect that told its own story about a man who had been fighting on too many fronts for too long. Nathaniel Carter had inherited Iron Creek Ranch 4 years ago when his father died. She had pieced that together from the ledger dates and from things Rodrigo said in the particular way Rodrigo said things he considered common knowledge, offhandedly, with the assumption that everyone already knew. The father had been a rancher of the old school, hard-working, personally honest, and financially careless, in the specific way of men who believe that enough hard work can substitute for enough careful accounting. He had left Nathaniel the land, the cattle, the debt, and the conviction, inherited rather than examined, that the ranch would be fine if you just kept working hard enough. Nathaniel was working hard enough. That had never been the question. The question was whether working hard enough was sufficient, and the answer, Eleanor had determined by day 11, was that it was not. Not with the Meridian loan coming due. Not with the vendor overcharges that had been bleeding the operation for over a year. Not with the deferred maintenance on the barn and the fence lines that would eventually demand payment whether or not the ranch was ready to make it. She was ready to tell him all of this in detail. What she was not ready for was what happened on the morning of day 12. She was in the workspace off the kitchen, her notebook open, her pen moving, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the yard. That was unusual. Iron Creek was not a quiet place. Men's voices carried across the open ground all day long. But the particular quality of these voices was different. There was an edge in them, the kind of edge that meant something had gone wrong. She set down her pen and went to look. 2 men she did not recognize had ridden in through the front gate. They were still on their horses. Big animals, both of them, well kept in the particular way that spoke of money rather than personal care. The men themselves were well dressed for the territory, which meant something specific. They were not ranch hands, not drifters, not any of the ordinary working types who moved through the Wyoming landscape. One of them was holding a folded document. Nathaniel was standing in the yard facing them. His posture was the one she had come to recognize, still, centered, occupying exactly the space he needed and no more. But there was something tight in the line of his jaw that she had not seen before. Samuel was off to one side, slightly behind Nathaniel, which told her Samuel knew what this was about and was not happy. She stayed on the porch and listened. "You're 6 weeks past the review date, Carter," the man with the document was saying. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who is used to having the leverage in a conversation. "Mr. Aldridge at Meridian has been patient, but patient has a limit." "I know the terms of my loan," Nathaniel said. "Then you know the review clause," the man said. "Meridian has the right to request a financial review at the 2-year mark. That was 6 weeks ago. We're here to conduct it. I was under the impression the review was scheduled for spring." "The schedule changed," the man said pleasantly. Mr. Aldridge felt the current market conditions warranted an earlier look. Eleanor watched Nathaniel's jaw tighten. "I'll need a week to prepare the records," he said. "We'll need to see them today," the man said. "Standard procedure." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Nothing to worry about if the books are in order." Eleanor stepped off the porch. She did not plan it. She did not think it through. She simply moved, the way she had always moved when a number was wrong, or a situation was sliding toward an outcome that could be corrected if someone acted fast enough. "Mr. Carter," she said, coming to stand beside him. Nathaniel turned his head and looked at her. The 2 men on horses looked at her too. She watched them do it. The same sweep, the same assessment, the same slightly too quick readjustment of expression. The man with the document covered it faster than his companion, which told her he was the professional one. "Who is this?" the man asked. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said. "She handles the ranch accounts." A pause. The man looked from Nathaniel to Eleanor and back to Nathaniel with an expression that was almost amusement, as though the situation had just become slightly less serious than he had expected. "She handles the accounts," he repeated. "That's correct," Eleanor said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that the most effective thing a woman in her position could do was speak at exactly the same volume as she would speak to anyone else, which denied the other person the satisfaction of seeing her try harder than necessary. "And the accounts are currently being audited. An audit that is not complete. We would be happy to schedule a formal review once the audit is finalized, which will be at the end of this week." "I'm afraid that's not." "I'm afraid it is," she said. "An incomplete audit provides an inaccurate picture of the ranch's financial position. If you conduct a review today, you will be reviewing numbers that I have already identified as containing errors, vendor overcharge corrections, payroll discrepancies, deferred maintenance reclassifications. Would Meridian prefer to make its assessment on incorrect numbers or on corrected ones?" The man on the horse looked at her for a long moment. His companion glanced at him. "End of the week," the man said finally. "Friday. We'll return Friday morning." "Friday morning," Eleanor confirmed. "The records will be ready." The 2 men turned their horses and rode back out through the gate. The yard was silent. Nathaniel turned and looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. "How much time do we actually have?" he said quietly. 4 days, she said. "It will be enough. But I need you to bring me everything. Every record you have, every receipt, every contract, anything with a number on it." "Sam," Nathaniel said, without looking away from her. "Already moving," Samuel said, and headed for the office at a pace considerably faster than his usual walk. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor a moment longer. "Thank you," he said. It was the second time he had said something like that to her. Both times, he had said it simply, without inflation, without the kind of gratitude that embarrassed the recipient. Both times, it had landed differently than she expected. She nodded and went back to the workspace. She did not sleep much in the 4 days that followed. She worked from before 5 in the morning until past midnight, moving through the records Samuel brought her in batches: contracts, receipts, auction logs, maintenance records, everything that had accumulated in the ranch's office over 4 years and, in some cases, before that. She organized it. She cross-referenced it. She built a picture of Iron Creek's financial history that was more complete than anything that had existed before. And she built it in the particular way that matters when someone hostile is going to be looking at it. Every number supported by documentation, every discrepancy explained and corrected, every improvement tracked against the baseline. Margaret came on the second day and brought food without being asked, because she was that kind of person. She set a plate of biscuits and cold chicken on the corner of the workspace table and looked at the spread of papers and said, "How bad is it?" "It is manageable," Eleanor said, without looking up. "It will be manageable by Friday." "But right now?" "Right now it looks worse than it is, which is why I need it to stop looking that way before those men come back." Margaret sat down. "Do you know who Aldridge is, at Meridian?" Eleanor looked up then. Margaret's voice had shifted. Not alarmed, but careful. The way voices got when something deserved more than casual attention. "Tell me," Eleanor said. "Cornelius Aldridge," Margaret said. "He's been at Meridian for 6 years. He came out from St. Louis and he's been... There are people who say he is not what he presents himself to be. There have been 3 ranches in this territory that took loans from Meridian and then found themselves in default on terms they didn't remember agreeing to. 2 of those ranches are under different ownership now." Eleanor set down her pen. "Who owns them?" she said. "The buyers were shell operations," Margaret said. "Companies with names that don't trace back to anything obvious. But there are people in Laramie who think Aldridge is behind it. That the review clauses in the loans are written to trigger early, under conditions that the ranchers couldn't anticipate, specifically so Meridian can move on defaulted properties at below-market prices." Eleanor was very still. "That's the business model," she said slowly. "That's what people think," Margaret said. "Nobody has been able to prove it." Eleanor looked at the papers spread across the table. She looked at the loan agreement, which she had pulled from the files 2 days ago. She had been treating it as a straightforward debt instrument, unfavorable but legitimate. She had not been looking at it as a potential trap. She started looking at it that way now. "Margaret," she said, "I need you to leave the food and come back tomorrow." Margaret stood up immediately. "What do you need?" "I need to read this contract for a different kind of problem than I was reading it for before," Eleanor said. "And I need to do that alone." Margaret left. She did not ask any more questions, which was one of the things Eleanor was coming to appreciate most about her. Eleanor read the Meridian loan agreement for the next 4 hours. She read it the way her father had taught her to read contracts, slowly, twice through at normal pace, then once more specifically looking for language that did not mean what it appeared to mean. The kind of language that gave one party options the other party did not know they were granting. The kind of language that sat quietly in a document until someone needed it. She found it on page 6. It was a clause about the review process. On its face, it gave Meridian the right to conduct a financial review at the 2-year mark, which was what the man on the horse had cited. But buried in the subclause, in language that was technically clear but practically obscure, was a provision that said any review. Finding a debt-to-asset ratio above a specific threshold gave Meridian the right to accelerate the loan, to demand full repayment within 60 days rather than at the original due date. The threshold was written as a fraction. Eleanor did a quick calculation on her notepad. Then she did it again, more carefully. Iron Creek Ranch's current debt-to-asset ratio, calculated on the numbers as they existed in the uncorrected ledger, was above the threshold. On the corrected numbers, with the vendor overcharges removed, the payroll discrepancies fixed, the deferred maintenance properly reclassified, it was below it. Not comfortably below, but below. The difference was 11%. That was the number. That was what Aldridge's men were counting on. That when they showed up with their formal review, the books would be in the state they had been in before Eleanor arrived, and the ratio would clear the threshold, and Meridian would have the contractual right to accelerate the loan, and Nathaniel Carter would have 60 days to come up with the full amount, which he did not have, and Iron Creek Ranch would default, and Aldridge would move on it at below market price, the way he had moved on the 2 ranches before it. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She thought about the timing. The review clause triggered at 2 years. The ranch hand she had replaced had left. She had gathered this from Rodrigo, about 3 months ago, taking with him whatever organizational competence had previously been applied to the records. 3 months of no oversight, compounding the existing problems, pushing the ratio higher and higher, right up until the review date. That was not coincidence. That was a plan. She picked up her pen and went back to work. And this time she was not simply auditing for accuracy. She was building a defense. She was still building it at 2 in the morning when Nathaniel knocked on the workspace door. She had heard him in the kitchen, moving quietly the way people move when they're trying not to disturb a working house. She had heard him pour coffee. She had heard him stop outside the workspace door. "Come in," she said. He came in. I was in his work clothes still, which meant he had not been to bed either. He looked at the papers spread across the table, the controlled chaos of someone who knows exactly where everything is, even when it looks like nothing is in order. And he looked at her face. He pulled up the other chair and sat down and set one of the 2 coffee cups he was carrying in front of her. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him about the clause. She told him about the threshold. She told him about the ratio. She told him about the 11% gap between where the ranch's books currently stood and where they needed to stand for the clause to be unenforceable. And then she told him what she thought Aldridge had done. Nathaniel listened. He drank his coffee. He did not interrupt her. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You think this was deliberate," he said. "I think the timing is too precise to be accidental," she said. "The review triggering early, arriving before you had time to prepare. The subclause written specifically to be missed on a first reading. It follows a pattern Margaret told me about. 2 other ranches, same terms, same outcome." "Margaret knows this?" "Margaret has been paying attention," Eleanor said. "She is a woman alone on 40 acres in Wyoming territory. Paying attention is how she has kept her land." Nathaniel was quiet again. "What do we do?" he said. And the way he said it, simply, directly, without any of the instinctive masculine qualification that would have come from most men in his position, the "we do" rather than the "what can you do," landed somewhere in Eleanor's chest that she was not prepared for. She looked down at her notebook. "We make the books unimpeachable," she said. "Every correction documented with the source. Every number traceable back to an original record. We put the debt-to-asset ratio below the threshold, and we make it impossible to dispute. And when Aldridge's men come on Friday, we give them nothing to work with." "Is that possible in 4 days?" "3 days now," she said. "Yes, it's possible." He looked at her. "You haven't slept." "I'll sleep on Saturday," she said. He almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was the kind of expression that existed in the space before a smile, brief and genuine. She had never seen it on him before. "I'll let you work," he said. He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup. He paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked up. "I want you to know," he said slowly, "that whatever happens Friday, whatever those men find or don't find, I'm glad you were here when they rode in." She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. He nodded once and left. Eleanor listened to his footsteps cross the kitchen floor and go still. Then she looked back at the papers. She thought about the 11%. She picked up her pen. She worked until the sun came up. Friday arrived with the particular crispness of a Wyoming morning that does not care about human anxiety, the air sharp and clear and entirely indifferent to the fact that Eleanor had slept 4 hours in the past 48, and that the 2 men from Meridian were riding through the front gate at precisely 9 o'clock. She was at the kitchen table when they came in. She had arranged the records herself, in a specific order. Not the order that was most convenient for a routine review, but the order that told the story she needed told. Corrected figures first, supported by original documentation. The vendor overcharge correspondence, with Cheyenne's written acknowledgement. The payroll corrections with the reconciled work logs. The deferred maintenance reclassified as capital investment. And at the front, clearly labeled, the debt-to-asset ratio calculation, with every number sourced. The man with the document, she had learned his name was Walsh, sat down across from her. His companion set himself by the wall and did not speak. Nathaniel stood near the door. Samuel stood beside him. Walsh opened the records. He was methodical. She gave him that. He worked through the ledger with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, and he did not rush, which meant he was looking for something specific and taking his time finding it. She watched him find it. She watched his expression when he reached the debt-to-asset calculation. He checked it twice. He looked at the documentation. He looked at the Cheyenne vendor correspondence. He looked up at Eleanor. "These corrections," he said. "They've been made recently. They have been documented recently," she said. "The errors they correct have existed for some time. Errors which, I would note, were compounded by the absence of qualified oversight in the months before I arrived." She paused. "All of the corrections are supported by original source documents which I have included for your review. Everything you see in this ledger is verifiable." Walsh looked at her with the careful expression of a man recalculating. "The ratio," he said, "is below the threshold specified in Section 6, Subclause B of the loan agreement," she said, "by 11%, as documented on the front page. If you'd like to verify the calculation independently, I can walk you through the methodology." He did not take her up on that. He closed the ledger. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Eleanor. "I'll need to take a copy of the corrected records back to Meridian," he said. "Of course," she said. "I have prepared a copy for exactly that purpose." She slid a bound set of documents across the table. "Mr. Aldridge is welcome to review them at his convenience." Walsh took the documents. His companion, by the wall, had not moved. He was watching Eleanor in the way that made her feel the review had never really been about the numbers at all. Walsh stood up. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It does." Walsh and his companion left. The sound of horses moving out through the gate was the cleanest sound Eleanor had heard in days. Nathaniel waited until the gate was closed before he said anything. Then he said, 11%. 11%, she confirmed. "If you hadn't been here," he said. "I was here," she said. She was too tired for hypotheticals. He looked at her. That look again. The focused, methodical one. The one that turned over what it was examining with real care. "Sit down before you fall down," he said. "Sam, get her coffee." "I'm fine." "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," he said. It was not a command. It was not quite a request either. It was something in between, said with the tone of a man who was paying attention to someone else's limits, because that person was not paying attention to them herself. She sat down. Samuel brought coffee. She wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth move up through her palms, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, Nathaniel was still standing there, watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. "What happens next?" he said. "Aldridge will look at those records," she said. "He will find them correct, because they are. He will not be able to trigger the acceleration clause. The loan returns to its original timeline." She paused. "But he will not be happy about it. And men like Aldridge, when they lose one approach, look for another." "Meaning?" "Meaning we should not assume this is finished," she said. "We should spend the next several months making this ranch as financially solid as possible, so that if he looks for another approach, he finds nothing to use." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Several months," he said. It was not the financial implication he was noting. She could hear that in the way he said it. She met his eyes. "I haven't had cause to leave," she said. A beat of silence. "Good," he said. And then he looked away, toward the window, and she saw the line of his jaw ease in a way that she was beginning to recognize as Nathaniel Carter's version of visible relief. The next 2 weeks were different. The tension that had been running through the ranch like a current under dry ground. Present, invisible, potentially dangerous, had not disappeared, but it had changed. It had become something that moved alongside the work, rather than underneath it, which made it possible to work without the constant awareness of standing on uncertain ground. Eleanor's role at Iron Creek shifted without anyone declaring that it had shifted. Nathaniel started consulting her before he made financial decisions, not because she had asked to be consulted, but because the habit formed naturally out of what had happened with Walsh and the Meridian records. The understanding that her perspective on numbers was worth having before the numbers became a problem. The ranch hands adjusted. Pete adjusted last, and the most visibly, and in the way that young men who have made asses of themselves often adjust, with an awkward overcorrection that expressed itself as excessive helpfulness. He started holding doors. He started clearing his plate faster at supper so as not to delay the table. Eleanor accepted all of this without comment, which was the kindest thing she could have done for him, and she suspected on some level he knew it. James, the quiet one, remained quiet, but he had begun, in his undemonstrative way, to do a specific thing. Whenever Eleanor was walking across the yard with anything heavy, supply inventory, water from the pump, the occasional awkward armload of firewood, he appeared. Not urgently, not making a production of it. Just appeared, and took the awkward thing, and walked beside her to wherever she was going, and set it down, and went back to what he had been doing. He never said a word about it. She never thanked him out loud. It was an entirely silent negotiation that suited them both perfectly. Rodrigo, by the end of the third week, had stopped teaching her his recipes and started asking for hers. That was the highest honor he had to give, and they both understood it. Margaret came 3 times that week, twice with food, and once just to talk. It was on the third visit, the talking one, a Tuesday afternoon when Nathaniel was out riding the fence line with Samuel and the kitchen was quiet, that Margaret said the thing that Eleanor had been turning around the edges of for days. "He watches you, you know," Margaret said. She was sitting with her coffee, entirely relaxed, looking at Eleanor with the particular directness that was her most consistent quality. "He watches the work," Eleanor said. "He watches you doing the work," Margaret said. "Those are different things." Eleanor did not answer. "Eleanor," Margaret said, "I am your friend. I say this as your friend. That man has been running this ranch alone for 4 years, and in those 4 years I have watched 2 women try to get his attention, one directly and one through considerable maneuvering, and he noticed neither of them. He notices you." "He notices that I am useful," Eleanor said. "He noticed you were useful on the first day," Margaret said. "That's not what I'm describing." Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. "Margaret," she said. "I know," Margaret said more gently. "I know what you're thinking." "Do you?" "You're thinking that a man like that, a man who looks like that, and owns what he owns, and has the respect of every person in this territory, doesn't look at a woman built the way you are built, and feel what you're hoping he might feel." Eleanor said nothing. "And I'm telling you," Margaret said, "that the man I have watched for the last 3 weeks is not looking at you the way a man looks at a useful employee." Eleanor looked up. Margaret's face was entirely serious. "I've been wrong before," Eleanor said. "So have I," Margaret said. "But I have also been right, and I know what right looks like." Eleanor looked at this wall for a moment. She thought about Gerald Fairbanks and his gentle, devastating gentleness, and the 3 months of smiling, and the particular constitution. She thought about 25 years of learning to want very little so that she could survive being given less than that. "Even if you're right," Eleanor said quietly, "I don't know what to do with that." "Nothing," Margaret said. "You don't have to do anything. I just wanted you to know that the story you've been telling yourself about what's possible for you, I'm not sure it's accurate anymore." Eleanor looked at her. Margaret picked up her coffee cup and smiled. "More coffee?" she said. The conversation sat with Eleanor for 3 days. She did not act on it. She did not know how to act on it, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she was frightened by it, in a way she had not been frightened by Walsh or Aldridge, or the 11% gap, or any of the things that had a clear problem and a clear solution. Those things she knew how to address. This was different. This was the part of life where Eleanor Whitmore had never had a strategy. She kept working. She compiled the full financial report, 30 pages, clearly organized, with a section on corrected current status, a section on recommended actions over the next 6 months, and a section on the Meridian loan and the specific steps she recommended for managing the relationship going forward. She had the barn wall repair prioritized, with estimated costs and a preferred contractor sourced from asking around in the territory. She had a renegotiated supply schedule for the Cheyenne vendor, formalized in writing. She presented it to Nathaniel on a Thursday evening after supper, when the hands had cleared out and the house was quiet. He sat across from her at the table and read it. He read slowly. He read the way she had come to recognize as his way, thoroughly, without skipping, returning to sections he wanted to reconsider. It took him almost an hour. When he finished, he closed the report and set it on the table and looked at her. "This is extraordinary," he said. She had not expected that word. She had expected something more practical. "Good work," or "I'll look at the contractor you recommended," or something along those lines. "It's thorough," she said. "It's more than thorough," he said. "It's the clearest picture of this ranch anyone has ever given me, including my father." He paused. "My father loved this land, but he never understood it the way this report describes it." "Numbers aren't about love," she said. "They're about paying attention to what's actually happening." "Are you saying my father didn't pay attention?" "I'm saying he paid attention to what he knew how to pay attention to," she said. "That's not a criticism, it's how people are. We see what we're equipped to see." Nathaniel turned the report over in his hands. He was quiet. "What are you equipped to see?" he said. "That other people miss?" The question was direct and genuine, and had nothing performative in it, which meant she had to answer it the same way. "When something is wrong before it announces itself," she said. "My father used to say I had a surgeon's mind. Every problem has a point where it can be corrected cheaply, and a point where it can only be corrected expensively, and then a point where it cannot be corrected at all. I see the cheap point faster than most people." I was looking at her the way Margaret had described. She was trying not to see it, and also could not stop seeing it, and was very aware of both of those things happening at once. "Is that what you saw in this ranch?" he said. "The cheap point?" "Just barely," she said. "Another 2 months, and it would have been the expensive point. Another 6, and it might have been the last point." He nodded. "Then I'm glad you came when you did," he said. She thought about the letter, about the 23 days, about the false address and the wrong name on an envelope, and the chain of accidents that had deposited her in front of this ranch with 50 cents and a broken trunk latch. "So am I," she said. She meant the ranch. She was nearly certain he meant something more than that. She was not ready to be certain, but she was no longer certain she was wrong. And then, on the following Monday morning, everything that had been carefully, methodically building toward stability stopped being stable. Eleanor was at the supply shed, updating the inventory count, when she heard a horse come in fast through the gate. Not the measured pace of ranch business, but the hard, driven gallop that meant something had gone wrong somewhere outside the boundaries of Iron Creek. She came around the corner of the shed and saw James, the quiet one, climbing down from a lathered horse. Nathaniel was already crossing the yard toward him, and Samuel was moving from the barn at a pace that said he had heard the hoofbeats too. James looked at Nathaniel. "It's the Hendersons," he said. His voice was flat and quick, stripped of everything except what needed to be said. "Somebody hit them last night, took the livestock they had penned, broke the fence on the east pasture, and left a message on the barn door that if they don't sell the property by end of month, next time it won't be livestock." The yard went silent. Eleanor stood at the corner of the supply shed and felt something move through her that was cold and entirely clear. "Is the family safe?" Nathaniel asked. "Shaken," James said. "But yes, they're safe." "The message," Samuel said. "Any idea who left it?" "None in writing," James said. "But Ed Henderson says the horses that came through were well-bred stock, not drifters, somebody with money." Nathaniel looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Nathaniel. Eleanor looked at both of them. "Aldridge," she said. They looked at her. She had not meant to say it out loud. But it was the only thing that made sense. The timing, the methodology, The targeting of a neighboring property. The way it fit the pattern Margaret had described. Shell operations. Below market acquisition. Pressure until the owner broke. You think this is connected to the loan? Nathaniel said. I think when a man loses one approach, Eleanor said, he uses another. She paused. The Hendersons. Are they carrying a loan? James glanced at Nathaniel. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Yes. From Meridian. The cold clarity in Eleanor's chest sharpened. Then this isn't over, she said. It was never over. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at James. Ride back and tell Ed Henderson to come here this evening. Bring his family if they'll come. Tell him Iron Creek is not going to leave him standing alone in this. James was back on his horse and moving before Nathaniel finished the sentence. Samuel looked at Nathaniel. What's the plan? I don't know yet, Nathaniel said. He looked at Eleanor. But I have a feeling we're going to need those numbers again. Eleanor was already thinking. She was thinking about what it would mean to help the Hendersons without depleting Iron Creek's own fragile stability. She was thinking about what it would mean to go up against a man with the resources of Cornelius Aldridge and a bank behind him. She was thinking about the difference between a problem with a cheap solution and a problem with an expensive one, and whether this particular problem had already passed the point where anything but a fight would serve. She looked at Nathaniel. I'll need to see the Henderson loan documents, she said, if he brought them. I'll make sure he does, Nathaniel said. She nodded and walked back to the workspace. She sat down at the table. She looked at the blank page of her notebook. She thought about the 23 days on the road, and the 50 cents, and the letter that was never meant for her. She thought about how she had arrived here looking for a job. She was starting to understand what she had actually found. She picked up her pen. Ed Henderson arrived at Iron Creek just after sundown with his wife Clara and their 2 daughters. The older one, maybe 14, and the younger one half that age. The younger one was holding something. A cloth doll, Eleanor noticed, clutched against her chest with both arms, the way children hold things when the world has frightened them past the point of pretending it hasn't. Eleanor saw them from the workspace window and was at the front door before Samuel had finished tying their horse. Clara Henderson was a thin woman with capable hands, and the particular kind of tired that does not come from one bad night, but from a sustained period of holding too much together. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at the house, and then looked at Eleanor, and something in her face did the thing faces do when a person has been bracing for judgment and unexpectedly receives none. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor said, come inside. There's coffee and supper on the stove. Clara looked at her husband. Ed Henderson was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a face that had been weathered into something honest and tired. He was carrying a saddlebag over one arm that Eleanor recognized, from the way he held it, as containing papers. Good. He had brought the documents. Mr. Henderson, Nathaniel said, coming across the yard. He extended his hand. I'm glad you came. Didn't know where else to go, Ed said. He shook Nathaniel's hand with the grip of a man who was holding himself together through physical effort. Nate, I've got 2 daughters and a wife, and I don't know what these people want from me. Well? He stopped. He looked at the saddlebag. I know what they want. I just don't know what to do about it. Come inside, Nathaniel said. We're going to figure that out. They came inside. Rodrigo had, in the way Rodrigo had of anticipating things, made enough supper for 8 people. Eleanor moved Clara and the girls to the far end of the table where the food was, and sat them down and poured coffee, and did not make a production of any of it, because Clara Henderson was a woman who would be embarrassed by too much fuss, and Eleanor understood that immediately. While the girls ate, and Clara drank her coffee, in the particular silence of someone who needs a moment before they can speak, Eleanor sat down at the near end of the table with Nathaniel and Ed and Samuel and said, Mr. Henderson, I need to see the loan documents. Ed looked at Nathaniel. She's the one who held off Meridian's review, Nathaniel said simply. Show her. Ed opened the saddlebag and spread the documents on the table. Eleanor read them. She read them fast, the way she read things when the urgency was real, running her finger down the columns of language with the focused speed of someone who knows what words to look for. Ed watched her with the expression of a man watching a doctor examine a wound, hoping and afraid of what the verdict might be. She found the clause on page 5. The same subclause, the same threshold language, the same trap. "When did you take this loan?" she asked. 14 months ago, Ed said. "We needed to expand the herd. The terms seemed fair. The man at Meridian, Aldridge, he was very pleasant." "He always is," Eleanor said. "You know him?" "I know his method." She turned to page 7. "Mr. Henderson, have you received any formal communication from Meridian about a review?" "Not in writing," Ed said. "But a man came by 2 weeks ago, said he was doing routine outreach, asked a lot of questions about the herd numbers and the property value." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel's jaw had gone tight. "He was assessing the ratio," Eleanor said, "before sending anyone to the property." She looked back at the loan document. "Your debt-to-asset ratio. Do you know what it is currently?" Ed shook his head. "I'm not. I handle cattle, Miss Whitmore. I'm not a numbers man." "That's all right," she said. "Do you have your most recent ledger?" He reached into the saddlebag and produced a battered account book. She opened it. She worked through the calculation in 12 minutes. Ed watched her. Nathaniel watched her. Samuel watched her. Clara, from the other end of the table, had gone very still over her coffee cup. Eleanor looked up. "Your ratio is above the threshold," she said, "by approximately 8%. The silence at the table was the kind that weighs something. "What does that mean?" Ed asked. "It means that if Meridian conducts a formal review, they have the contractual right to accelerate your loan. Demand full repayment within 60 days. She paused. "Which you cannot make." "No," Ed said. His voice was flat. "No, I cannot." "And if you default, the property goes to the bank," Eleanor said. "Which is what they want." Ed looked at his hands on the table. "My father broke that land," he said quietly. 40 years ago. My father." Nobody said anything. Clara, from the other end of the table, made a sound that was very small and very controlled. The younger daughter looked up from her plate and looked at her mother and then looked back at her plate. Eleanor looked at the ledger. She looked at the loan document. She looked at the calculation she had written in her notebook. 8%. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "when did you last sell cattle?" "Spring auction," he said. "April." "And you have animals ready for fall auction?" "I've got 18 head that would bring good prices," he said. "Maybe 20 if the 2 late calves develop right." "At current market prices, 18 head at fall auction would improve your asset position by how much?" she asked. He thought. He was better with the cattle numbers than the ledger numbers. She could see him computing in the way people compute when the information is in muscle memory rather than written down. "Maybe $350, he said. "On a good day at market." "And the property improvements you made this year, the new fence sections, the water access work, have those been recorded in the ledger at their actual value?" Ed blinked. "I just put down what they cost." "What they cost and what they're worth are different numbers," Eleanor said. She looked at the ledger again. "You put the fence work down as an expense. It's an asset improvement. If it's properly reclassified and assessed at current value, it changes the calculation." She picked up her pen. "May I?" He nodded. She started working. She worked through the numbers with the focused economy of movement. She always brought to a problem that had a solution somewhere inside it. The only question being how deep you had to go to find it. She reclassified the fence work. She added the anticipated auction proceeds as a projected asset adjustment with a notation. She found 2 additional property improvements in the ledger. A new water tank, a repaired outbuilding, that Ed had recorded as expenses rather than assets. Recalculated. She looked up. "If I adjust the record to properly reflect your asset position," she said, "and if you bring 18 head to fall auction and apply the proceeds directly to principal reduction, your ratio drops below the threshold." Ed stared at her. "By how much?" Nathaniel asked. 3%, Eleanor said. "It's not comfortable, but it's below the line." 3%, Ed said. He said it slowly, like a man learning a word in a foreign language. 3% is the difference between keeping my land and losing it. 3% is the difference, Eleanor confirmed. But Mr. Henderson, this only holds if Meridian does not conduct the review before fall auction. If they move on the review now, before you've sold the cattle, the numbers don't work. The table went quiet. How long do we need? Nathaniel asked. Fall auction in this territory is when? Eleanor asked. First week of October, Samuel said. 6 weeks, Eleanor said. She looked at Nathaniel. We need 6 weeks. Aldridge is not going to wait 6 weeks, Nathaniel said. Not if he already knows the numbers. Not if the message on the Henderson barn was the opening move. No, Eleanor said. He is not going to wait. She sat back. She thought. The problem had two components. The financial component and the threat component. And they were connected in the way that Aldridge had designed them to be connected, each one making the other worse. The financial pressure made the threat more effective. The threat made the financial pressure harder to address. It was an elegant trap, in the particular way that traps built by intelligent, unscrupulous people are elegant. She looked at the loan document again. She looked at page 6. She looked at page 8. Then she looked at page 9, which she had read but had not focused on, because page 9 appeared to be a standard boilerplate section about dispute resolution and arbitration. She read it again. Her pen stopped moving. Mr. Henderson, she said, did anyone explain this section to you when you signed? She turned the document around and pushed it across the table to him, pointing at the paragraph. He bent over it. He read slowly. He looked up. The part about disputes? The part about the review process specifically, she said. This clause says that in the event of a dispute over the review methodology, either party may request a third-party assessment before the review results are considered binding. Nathaniel leaned in and read it. Samuel leaned in and read it. The table was very still. What does that mean? Ed asked. It means, Eleanor said, and she felt the cold clarity in her chest become something warmer and more focused, that if you dispute the methodology of Meridian's review, if you formally contest the way they're conducting the calculation, they cannot act on the review results until a third party has assessed the dispute. She paused. Which takes time, which buys time, which might be 6 weeks. Ed looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Can we actually dispute the methodology? Nathaniel asked. We can dispute the fact that they are treating an accelerated review as standard procedure when the original loan schedule specified a 2-year review, Eleanor said. We can dispute the asset classification methodology, which I have already identified as incorrectly applied in at least 3 instances. We can dispute the fact that the review was announced verbally rather than in writing, which this same document, on page 3, specifies as required procedure. She tapped the page. 3 grounds for dispute. Any one of them might hold long enough. The room held its breath. Then Ed Henderson did something that surprised Eleanor completely. He reached across the table and put his big, work-hardened hand over hers. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, My father would have sold that land for a song if he'd known those papers were going to eat him alive. I always thought the land was the hardest part. He took his hand back. He looked at Eleanor with the direct, uncomplicated gratitude of a man who has no language for elegance, but knows what honest looks like. You're telling me the paper might save it. The paper, and 6 weeks, and 18 head of cattle, she said. He almost smiled. That I can work with. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Write the dispute letter, he said. I'll have it ready in the morning, she said. Clara Henderson, from the other end of the table, said quietly, Thank you, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor looked at her. Clara was looking back at her with the particular expression of one woman recognizing another woman who has spent a long time being underestimated and has learned to carry it with grace. It's not done yet, Eleanor said, but we're not finished either. She started writing. What none of them anticipated was what happened 3 days later. Eleanor was at the workspace, refining the Henderson dispute filing, when Margaret arrived at a pace that was not her usual easy walk. She came through the kitchen door without knocking, which was not unusual, Margaret had stopped knocking 2 weeks into their friendship, but the look on her face was. "Sit down," Eleanor said immediately, because Margaret's face said something large had happened. "I don't want to sit down," Margaret said. "Eleanor, I was in town this morning, at the dry goods store." She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table. "There are 2 men staying at the Laramie Hotel. They arrived yesterday. People who know them say they work for Aldridge, not the bank, his private operations, enforcement men." Eleanor looked at her. "Enforcement," she repeated. "They're asking questions about Iron Creek," Margaret said. "About the ranch layout. About when Nathaniel rides out and how far." The air in the workspace went very still. "They're not here about the loan," Eleanor said. "No," Margaret said. "Eleanor, I think Aldridge has decided that if he can't take the ranch through the bank, he's going to take it through other means." Eleanor stood up. She thought about this message on the Henderson barn. She thought about the horses, well-bred stock, James had said, somebody with money. She thought about 2 men in a Laramie hotel asking about Nathaniel Carter's schedule. She thought about the timing. The dispute letter had gone out yesterday. Aldridge would have it by now, or soon. He was a man who moved fast when he was losing ground. "Where is Nathaniel?" she asked. "He rode out with James to check the north fence," Margaret said. "He took 2 men with him." "Samuel," Eleanor said. "Is Samuel here?" "I passed him by the barn." Eleanor moved. She was out of the workspace and across the kitchen and out into the yard in under a minute. Samuel was exactly where Margaret had said, by the barn, working on a piece of tack with the unhurried competence of a man who has done the same task 10,000 times. He looked up when he heard her coming, and his face changed. "What happened?" he said. She told him. Samuel did not waste time on reaction. He set down the tack and looked at the road north, toward where Nathaniel had ridden, and then looked at the ranch gate and made the rapid, instinctive calculation of a man who has been reading physical situations for 40 years. "Pete," he said, raising his voice toward the bunkhouse. "Henry, Cole." The men appeared. "Ride to the north fence," Samuel said. "Find Mr. Carter and James and bring them back. Don't explain. Just tell him Sam said now." He looked at Pete. "Fast." Pete was on a horse in under 2 minutes. Henry and Cole followed 30 seconds behind him. Samuel looked at Eleanor. "You think they'll move on the ranch directly?" he said. "I think a man who has already demonstrated he will send riders to terrorize a neighboring family," she said, "and who has just received a legal dispute that blocks his next approach. Yes, I think he will escalate." Samuel nodded. His face was calm, in the particular way of experienced men facing trouble they've faced variations of before. "How many men do you think?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "Enough to make a statement." If they come tonight, Eleanor said, "we need to be ready, and we need the Hendersons warned." Samuel looked at her. A beat passed. That same beat she had seen before from the men of Iron Creek. The moment of recalibration when they encountered the fact that Eleanor's thinking ran fast and practical, and exactly as fast and practical as the situation required. "I'll send a rider to the Hendersons," he said. "You go back inside. Make sure Margaret stays." "Margaret rides," Eleanor said. "She has her own property to think about." "Then make sure she knows the situation," Samuel said. "And Eleanor." She was already turning. "You did right," he said. "Coming straight to me. That was right." She nodded and went back inside. Nathaniel arrived back at the ranch in under an hour. He came through the gate at a pace that said Pete had communicated the urgency correctly, and he came with 6 men behind him instead of the 2 he'd left with. He'd picked up the others along the fence line on the way back. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, which was the kind of movement that told Eleanor his mind had already moved past what he didn't know and straight to what he was going to do about it. He came into the kitchen. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Margaret. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said to Margaret. Margaret told him. She was precise and concise about it, which Eleanor had come to understand was Margaret's mode under pressure. The social ease burned away, and what was left underneath was something very clear and direct. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, He was quiet for 5 seconds. "The dispute letter," he said, looking at Eleanor. "That's what triggered this." "I believe so," Eleanor said. "He's been outmaneuvered on the financial side. He's moving to the other side." "Which means the letter worked," Nathaniel said. "The letter worked," she confirmed. "But working means he's angry. And angry men with resources and enforcement men on their payroll are dangerous." Nathaniel looked at Samuel. "What are we working with?" he said. "8 men here, counting yourself," Samuel said. "Pete, Henry, Cole, James, Rodrigo's boy who's been helping with the fence. That's 5 plus us. The Hendersons, if Ed arms up and comes." "Get word to Ed," Nathaniel said. "Tell him to bring who he has and come to Iron Creek. We hold here." "The women," Samuel said. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. He looked at Margaret. Something moved across his face. Not hesitation, but the particular weight of a man who is calculating risk for people whose safety matters to him in a way that is not purely practical. "We stay," Eleanor said, before he could speak. "Eleanor, Margaret knows this territory better than anyone in this room except Samuel," Eleanor said. "And I have been doing nothing for the last 3 days but building the paper case that will bring Aldridge down legally if we survive the night. That paper does not travel safely without me knowing what's in it." She looked at him directly. "We stay. We help. Tell us what you need." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very dark and very steady, and she could see in them the thing that Margaret had described. The way he looked at her. And she held his gaze and did not look away. "All right," he said. "Margaret, you know where we keep the rifles?" "Second cabinet in the office," Margaret said immediately. "I've known that for 2 years." Nathaniel almost smiled. Then the smile was gone, and he was moving, calling orders in a clear, quiet voice that the men responded to with the efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of moment, even if they had hoped it wouldn't come. The night was very long. They came at 2 in the morning. There were 7 of them, which was more than Eleanor had calculated, and exactly enough to mean business. She heard the horses before anyone else did. She had been awake at the workspace, unable to do anything useful, but unable to sleep either, with her father's watch in her hand and her ears tuned to the dark outside the window. And she was at Nathaniel's door in 30 seconds. She knocked hard. "They're coming." Howe was out in 15 seconds with his boots half on and his rifle in his hand, and she had never been so grateful in her life for a man who trusted her assessment without requiring her to repeat it. What followed was not a gunfight in the way that stories sometimes describe gunfights, clean and dramatic and conclusive. It was messier than that. It was dark and loud, and the horses were frightened, and 2 of Aldridge's men dismounted at the gate, and 2 more went for the barn, and the rest stayed on horseback and shouted things that were meant to frighten rather than negotiate. They had not anticipated 8 armed men and 2 armed women waiting for them. The first shot went into the air. Nathaniel fired it, deliberate and controlled, and the sound of it changed the entire character of what Aldridge's men had expected this night to be. They had expected a sleeping ranch. They had expected to break things and leave. They had not expected organized resistance. Eleanor was at the side of the main house with Margaret's rifle against the wall beside her. She had held a rifle exactly once in her life, when her father had insisted she learn in case she ever needed it, and she had hoped never to need it. And she was watching the gate with a concentration that left no room for fear. The man who came around the corner of the house was not expecting anyone to be there. He stopped. She said, "Don't." He looked at her, the weight of her, the woman standing in the dark where no woman should have been. And she watched him miscalculate. She watched him decide she was not a threat. He took 1 step forward. Samuel appeared from behind the water trough, directly behind the man, with a rifle leveled at the man's back. "I'd listen to her," Samuel said. The man stopped. He raised his hands. By the time the first gray light of morning started moving in from the east, 3 of Aldridge's 7 men were disarmed and secured in the barn. The other 4 had retreated, not in panic, but in the specific kind of organized withdrawal that meant they would be reporting back to someone about what they had found at Iron Creek, which was not what they had been told to expect. Ed Henderson had arrived at midnight with 2 armed neighbors, which had tipped the numbers decisively. He had come in through the back road, silent and dark, exactly where Nathaniel needed him. And Eleanor had watched the two men, Nathaniel and Ed, coordinate in the easy shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to communicate in economy. The three captured men refused to say who had sent them. Eleanor had expected that. She went into the barn, while Samuel and two of the hands kept watch, and she looked at the three men in the lamplight, and she said, "I don't need you to tell me who sent you. I already know. What I need to know is whether any of you are carrying documentation, contracts, letters, anything in writing that connects you to Meridian or to Cornelius Aldridge." The three men looked at each other. One of them, the youngest, maybe 22, with a cut above his eyebrow where he'd caught a fence post in the dark, looked at her and then looked away. That was enough. "Check their coats," she said to Samuel. Samuel checked. He found a folded letter in the inside pocket of the youngest man's coat. He handed it to Eleanor. She unfolded it. She read it. She read it twice. The letter was from Cornelius Aldridge. It did not name the ranch directly, but it named a property number that she had memorized from the deed records in Iron Creek's files 3 days ago, and it gave instructions for what it called a demonstration, a word chosen carefully enough to mean nothing in isolation and everything in context. It was signed with Aldridge's full name and dated 4 days earlier. 4 days. Before the dispute letter had arrived, which meant Aldridge had planned this move before he knew the letter was coming, which meant he had never intended to limit himself to financial pressure. The financial pressure and the physical intimidation had always been running on parallel tracks. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. She looked at the youngest man. "How old are you?" she said. He looked at her. He had the look of someone who had made a decision he had not fully thought through and was beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he'd agreed to. 20, he said. "Did Aldridge tell you what this property was?" she said. "That there were children here? That the family next door has 2 daughters?" He said nothing. "He didn't," she said. "It was not a question. He gave you a property number and told you to make a demonstration." The young man looked at the barn floor. "I'll give you a choice," Eleanor said. "You can sit here and say nothing, in which case the sheriff from Laramie will be here tomorrow, and you will answer for tonight with no one to speak for you. Or you can tell me, in writing, exactly what Aldridge told you, what he promised you, and what the other operations like this one have been. The Henderson property, the 2 ranches before that. And I will make certain the sheriff understands that you cooperated fully." The young man looked up. "He'll come after me," he said. "If I talk." "He'll come after you anyway," Eleanor said. "Once tonight is accounted for, you're a liability to him either way. The only question is whether you go into that accounting with something in your favor or with nothing." A long pause. "Paper," the young man said, "and something to write with." Eleanor looked at Samuel. Samuel left and came back in 90 seconds with both. She handed them to the young man. She waited. He wrote for 40 minutes. When he was done, she took the pages and read them by lamplight, standing in the barn with the morning coming in gray and cold through the gaps in the walls. And what she read was more than she had hoped for and less than she was surprised by. Names, dates, property numbers, 3 ranches in the Wyoming Territory and 1 in Colorado, all acquired through the same mechanism. The same loan structure, the same review clause, the same enforcement when legal pressure failed. Aldridge's name throughout. A second name she did not recognize. A man named Rourke, who appeared to be Aldridge's operational partner, the one who managed the enforcement side, and a 4th property in the pipeline. A property currently being assessed for acquisition, Margaret's 40 acres. Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. Then she breathed again. She folded the pages carefully with the letter from Aldridge inside. She walked out of the barn into the gray Wyoming morning and found Nathaniel standing by the fence, looking toward the road. He turned when he heard her. She handed him the folded papers. He opened them. He read. She watched his face as he read. When he finished, he looked up. "Margaret's property," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked toward the house, where Margaret had been since the retreat of Aldridge's men, helping Clara Henderson settle the girls who had slept through most of it. "She doesn't know yet," Eleanor said. "No," he said. "We need to go to Laramie," Eleanor said. "Today. We need to take these documents to the sheriff and to the territorial court, and we need to do it before Aldridge hears what happened here tonight and moves to cover himself." Nathaniel looked at the papers in his hands. He looked at Eleanor. "Come with me," he said. "I was going to," she said. Something moved across his face. Something she did not have a name for yet, but that she recognized as true. The way she recognized true things in numbers, by the quality of their consistency, by the way they held up no matter how many times you checked them. "I know you were," he said. He folded the papers and put them inside his coat. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "We'll need 2 horses, she said. "And Samuel should stay here with the men and the prisoners." "Agreed." He paused. He looked at her with the full weight of that focused attention. "You all right?" "I didn't sleep," she said. "But I'm all right." "Neither did I," he said. They stood there for a moment in the early morning light, neither of them moving, and the space between them was the kind of space that has something in it. Not words yet, not action yet, but the pressure of something that is building toward both. Then Nathaniel said, 10 minutes, and walked toward the house. Eleanor stood alone at the fence and looked at the road. She thought about Aldridge, somewhere in Laramie or Cheyenne or wherever men like him slept easy, not yet knowing that the night had not gone the way he planned. She thought about Margaret's 40 acres and the 40 years of her father's work on the Henderson land, and the 2 little girls with the cloth doll. She thought about the letter in her father's voice. Every problem has a point where it can be corrected cheaply, and a point where it can only be corrected expensively, and then a point where it cannot be corrected at all. This was still the expensive point. She was not going to let it reach the last one. She went to help saddle the horses. The ride to Laramie took 2.5 hours on hard roads, and they rode most of it in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Eleanor had never been particularly skilled at horseback riding. It was not something Boston had demanded of her. But she was not unskilled either, and she had enough stubbornness to cover what she lacked in technique. Nathaniel rode beside her and did not comment on her form and did not offer help she hadn't asked for, which was exactly the right thing to do. "About halfway," he said. "How did you know to check their coats?" "The youngest one looked away when I asked about documentation," she said. "People who have nothing to hide don't look away. They look at you." "You were watching all 3 of them at once." "I was watching the youngest one most carefully," she said. "He was the one most likely to have made a mistake. Experienced men don't carry letters. He was not experienced." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You know what you are?" he said. She glanced at him. "You are the most dangerous person Aldridge has ever underestimated," he said. "And he's going to figure that out today." Eleanor looked ahead at the road. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to be seen that way. Not as a burden, not as a mistake, not as a woman of a particular constitution, but as dangerous, in the specific sense of a person whose capabilities exceed what an opponent is prepared to account for. She had spent 25 years being underestimated. It had never felt like an advantage until now. "Then let's not keep him waiting," she said. And they rode on toward Laramie, the 2 of them, with the morning opening up wide and sharp around them, and a folded letter in Nathaniel Carter's inside coat pocket that was about to change everything. The sheriff of Laramie County was a man named Grover Hatch, and he had the face of someone who had heard every kind of story and believed approximately half of them. Howe was sitting behind his desk when Nathaniel and Eleanor walked in, and he looked at them the way he probably looked at everyone who came through that door before 8 in the morning, with the measured, non-committal attention of a man who had learned that urgency was contagious and that catching it prematurely was a waste of good judgment. "Nathaniel Carter," he said. Not a question. He knew Nathaniel. "Sit down, both of you." They sat. Nathaniel put the folded documents on the desk. Hatch looked at them. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathaniel. "Who is this?" he said. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," Nathaniel said. "She manages the accounts at Iron Creek. She's the one who found what's in those papers." Hatch picked up the papers. He unfolded them. He read slowly, the way a careful man reads something he knows is going to require him to make a decision he cannot unmake. Eleanor watched him read. She watched his face move through several adjustments. Skepticism first, then the particular stillness that meant something had caught his attention, then a frown that was not doubt, but concentration. He set the papers down. "The letter," he said, "dated 4 days ago, before your dispute filing went out." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And the testimony. This is from one of the men who came onto your property last night." "A voluntary written statement," Eleanor said. "He was not coerced. I gave him the choice. He chose to cooperate." "He names Aldridge directly." "He does. And he names a second individual, a man called Rourke, who appears to manage the operational side of Aldridge's activities separate from the bank." Hatch looked at the papers again. He turned to the young man's written statement and read a specific section twice. "4 properties," he said. 3 completed acquisitions and 1 in active targeting," Eleanor said. "The 4th property is owned by a woman named Margaret Hayes. She has 40 acres approximately 2 miles from Iron Creek Ranch." Hatch set the papers flat on the desk and pressed his palms against them. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitmore, how long have you been in Wyoming territory?" "Approximately 5 weeks," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something he had assumed. "In 5 weeks," he said slowly, "you identified a fraudulent loan scheme affecting at least 4 properties, documented it, survived a midnight raid, secured a written confession, and rode 2.5 hours to put it on my desk before breakfast." "The situation required it," she said. Hatch looked at Nathaniel. "Where did you find her?" he said. "She found me," Nathaniel said. "Long story." Hatch almost smiled. Almost. He picked up the documents and straightened them against the desktop and stood up. "I'm going to need you both to stay in Laramie today," he said. "I need signed statements, and I need to send a wire to the Territorial Marshal's office before I move on Aldridge, because if I'm going to walk into Meridian Bank and take the man's records, I'm going to do it with authority that nobody can challenge." "How long will that take?" Nathaniel asked. "Wire there and back. 4 hours, maybe 5. Hatch was already reaching for his coat. "There's a good breakfast place 3 doors east. Go eat something. You both look like you've been up all night." "We have," Eleanor said. "Go eat," he said. "Come back in an hour and give your statements to my deputy. I'll have the wire sent before you're done." He picked up the documents and walked out of his own office with the businesslike speed of a man who had just decided something and was not going to let the decision cool before he acted on it. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. "Breakfast," he said. "Breakfast," she agreed. They walked 3 doors east. The place was small and warm and smelled of coffee and bacon and the particular comfort of a working town breakfast place that has no pretension about what it is. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and a woman brought coffee without being asked, which Eleanor considered an act of profound grace. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Nathaniel watched her. "You should eat," he said. "I am going to eat," she said. "I'm drinking the coffee first." "Fair," he said. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Laramie was waking up. Wagons, voices, the ordinary sounds of a territorial town, going about its morning business with no idea that the legal architecture of Cornelius Aldridge's operation was approximately 4 hours away from beginning to collapse. "Can I ask you something?" Nathaniel said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "When you talked to that young man in the barn," he said, "the youngest one, you gave him a way out. You didn't have to do that." "I needed his testimony," she said. "You didn't need it to be voluntary," he said. "Hatch could have gotten it by other means." She considered that. "I was 20 years old," she said, "and Aldridge had not told him what he was actually doing. He thought he was working enforcement for a bank. He didn't know about the 4 families." She paused. "That's not an excuse, but it's a difference. You saw that in the barn, in the middle of the night." "I saw his face when I asked him about the children," she said. "He didn't know. You can't fake not knowing." Nathaniel was looking at her with the look that she had run out of ways to pretend she didn't notice. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had been Miss Whitmore, consistently and without exception, For 5 weeks. The shift was so small and so large at the same time that she felt it land in the center of her chest and stay there. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said. "And I need you to let me finish before you tell me I'm wrong." "I'm not in the habit of telling people they're wrong before they've finished," she said. "You might be this time," he said. She set down her coffee cup. "Then say it," she said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "The night Aldridge's men came," he said. "When it started, in that first half hour when I didn't know how many of them there were or where they were going to move, I was thinking about the ranch. I was thinking about the men. I was thinking about the Hendersons." He stopped. "And then I thought about where you were, whether you were inside, whether the house door was latched." He paused. "I couldn't account for you and keep my attention on everything else. I kept needing to know where you were." Eleanor said nothing. "That was the first time in 4 years," he said, "that I have thought about a specific person instead of the property during a crisis. The first time someone's location inside my ranch has mattered to me more than the situation outside it." She looked at him carefully. I was not a man who spoke at length about what he felt. She had understood that from the first week. This was not a speech. It was the considered, almost reluctant disclosure of a man who had decided that silence was no longer serving him. "You're telling me something," she said quietly. "I'm trying to," he said. "I'm not particularly skilled at it." "You're doing fine," she said. He looked up. "I know what you came here for," he said. "I know you came for a job. I know you've been building something, for yourself, not for me, and I don't want to complicate that." He stopped. "But I also can't sit across from you at a breakfast table in Laramie after the night we just had and pretend I haven't noticed that everything at Iron Creek is better because you're in it. Not just the books, not just the finances." He looked at her directly. "Everything." Eleanor was very still. She thought about Gerald Fairbanks and his gentle devastation. She thought about 25 years of learning to want at a manageable distance from actually having. She thought about the story she had been telling herself for so long that she had stopped being able to see around it. The story that said certain things were not available to a woman built the way she was built, and that the intelligent response was to make peace with that and find her worth in other things. She thought about Margaret sitting in the kitchen saying the story you've been telling yourself might not be accurate anymore. She looked at Nathaniel Carter. I was watching her with that steady, patient, methodical attention that had characterized him from the first day. The attention that did not rush, did not perform, did not need her to respond in any particular way. He was simply there, across a breakfast table, saying something true. "I'm not good at this either," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." "I've been told things," she said, "about what I am, what I can expect." She said it plainly, without drama, because she was not a dramatic person by nature, and the thing that had hurt her most about Gerald Fairbanks was that he had been gentle about it, which had made it harder, not easier. By people who thought they were being honest. "What kind of things?" he said. She looked at him. "The kind that a man who looked like you," she said, "would not have been told." He held her gaze. He understood. She could see him understand it. "People are wrong about a great many things," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are." "I would like," he said, "the chance to be right about this one." The breakfast arrived. The woman set the plates down and refilled their coffee and left without commentary, which Eleanor was grateful for. She looked at the food. She looked at Nathaniel. "Give me time," she said. "Don't ask me for certainty I don't have yet." "I'm not asking for certainty," he said. "I'm asking for a chance." She picked up her fork. "You already have it," she said. She did not look up from her plate when she said it, which was the closest she could come, in that moment, to saying the larger thing underneath it. But she felt him go still across the table, and then she felt him settle. The particular quality of a man whose attention has stopped searching and found what it was looking for. And that, she thought, was probably enough for now. They ate breakfast. They gave their statements to Hatch's deputy, a methodical young man who wrote everything down twice and asked clear questions. Eleanor walked him through the financial documentation in the same order she had organized it: loan clause, threshold calculation, asset reclassification, the pattern across 4 properties. And he recorded all of it without apparent skepticism, which was more than she had hoped for. Nathaniel gave his account of the previous night: the riders, the confrontation, the 3 captured men. The wire came back from the territorial marshal's office at 11:30. Eleanor was not privy to its contents, but she read the result of it in Hatch's face when he came back into the office: a specific quality of resolution that meant he had the authority he'd asked for. "All right," Hatch said. "I'm going to Meridian." "I want to be there," Eleanor said. Hatch looked at her. "She built the case," Nathaniel said simply. Hatch considered that for a moment. "You stand back," he said to Eleanor. "You observe. If I need you to explain something in the documents, I'll ask." "Understood," she said. They walked to Meridian Territorial Bank. It was a solid building on the main street of Laramie, the kind of building designed to communicate permanence and trustworthiness, which Eleanor now understood as the architectural equivalent of a trapdoor with a nice finish on the frame. She had never been inside it, but she had read its name in the corner of enough documents over the past 5 weeks that it felt almost familiar. Cornelius Aldridge was in his office. He was a well-built man in his mid-50s with silver hair and the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He stood when Hatch walked in, and his expression went through a rapid series of adjustments: professional welcome, then wariness at the deputy behind Hatch, then something flat and controlled when he saw Nathaniel, and then, when his eyes reached Eleanor, a fraction of a second of confusion before the control snapped back into place. He had not expected her to be there. Good. She had not expected him to be surprised by her, and surprise was the most useful thing she could take out of the first 30 seconds of this meeting. "Sheriff Hatch," Aldridge said. His voice was exactly what she had expected: smooth, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades speaking just carefully enough to mean nothing he couldn't walk back. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Sit down, Cornelius," Hatch said. He said it the way men say things when they are not actually offering an option. Aldridge sat. Hatch put the documents on the desk. He put the young man's written testimony on top. He put the signed letter, Aldridge's own letter, with Aldridge's own signature, and the property number that matched Iron Creek's deed, on top of that. Aldridge looked at the papers. He did not touch them. "I'm going to need your records," Hatch said. "All of them. Specifically the loan files for Iron Creek Ranch, the Henderson property, the 2 previous acquisitions, and the Hayes property." He paused. "And anything pertaining to a man named Rourke." A very long silence. Eleanor watched Aldridge's face. She watched him calculate, assess the documents on his desk, assess Hatch's tone, assess the presence of Nathaniel Carter standing large and quiet in the doorway, assess the deputy, and finally, last of all, assess her. His eyes rested on her for a moment longer than on anyone else. She did not look away. "I don't know what you think you have," Aldridge said finally. "I have a signed statement naming you by name," Hatch said. "I have a letter in your handwriting with a property number that corresponds to a ranch that was raided last night by 7 men who matched the description of your enforcement operation. And I have documentation of a financial scheme affecting at least 4 properties in this territory, built on loan clauses designed to trigger default." He paused. "I also have a wire from the territorial marshal authorizing me to compel the production of your records." Aldridge looked at the wire Hatch set on the desk. He looked at Eleanor again. "Who are you?" he said. Not hostile, genuinely curious, in the way of a man trying to understand where the failure had occurred. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I manage the accounts at Iron Creek Ranch." A pause. "You," he said slowly. "You filed the dispute letter." "I wrote it," she said. "Mr. Carter filed it." He looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at Eleanor. "I underestimated you," he said. It was almost conversational, almost admirably direct, given the circumstances. "Yes," she said, "you did." Hatch held out his hand. After a moment, Cornelius Aldridge opened his desk drawer and produced a set of keys. He handed them to Hatch. He did not speak again. They were back at Iron Creek by late afternoon. The 3 captured men from the previous night had been transported to Laramie by 2 of Hatch's deputies, while Hatch was at Meridian. Eleanor had arranged that by sending a message back with the deputy's assistant before they left the sheriff's office, a small logistical detail that had occurred to her while Nathaniel was finishing his statement. Samuel had reported it done when they rode through the gate. Margaret was still there. She was in the kitchen with Clara Henderson, and when Eleanor walked in, Margaret looked at her face and read it immediately. "Tell me," Margaret said. Eleanor sat down. She told her everything. The testimony, the letter, Hatch at Meridian, Aldridge handing over the keys. She told her about the 4th property on the list. Margaret was very still when she heard that part. "My land," she said. "Your land," Eleanor confirmed. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. "2 years ago," she said, "a man came to see me. Very pleasant. Said he might be interested in buying, if I ever wanted to sell. I told him I didn't." She paused. "He came back 6 months later. Said prices were only going one direction, and I should consider my options." She paused again. "He never said his name was Aldridge. He gave me a different name." "Rourke," Eleanor said. Margaret looked up. "Probably," Eleanor said. "He operated the property side. Aldridge was the bank." 2 years, Margaret said. "They've been looking at my land for 2 years and I didn't know." "You knew something," Eleanor said. "You knew enough to say no, twice." Margaret looked at her. "If you hadn't come," Margaret said. "If that letter hadn't been misaddressed." "It was misaddressed," Eleanor said. "I was in the right place." Clara Henderson, who had been listening from the end of the table, said quietly, "Amen to that." Margaret reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. She held it for a moment. Then she let go and straightened up and said, in the tone she used when she was pushing emotion back to a manageable distance, "Is it over?" "The immediate danger is over," Eleanor said. "The legal process will take time. Hatch will work through Aldridge's records and build the full case. The territorial marshal will be involved. It will be months before it resolves completely." She paused. "But Aldridge is done operating in this territory. The mechanism is broken. He can't use it again." Clara Henderson exhaled. It was a long, quiet exhale, the kind that carries weeks of held breath. "Ed will want to know that," she said, "as soon as possible." "He's still here?" Nathaniel asked. He had come in behind Eleanor, quiet as always. "He's helping James with the fence," Samuel said from the doorway. "Said he needed to do something with his hands." Nathaniel nodded. He went to find Ed. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and let herself be still for the first time in approximately 36 hours. Rodrigo appeared from somewhere and set a plate of food in front of her. He did this without ceremony, the way he did everything, and she was grateful for exactly that quality of it. She ate. Margaret watched her eat with the expression of someone who has been worried and is allowing themselves to stop. "Eleanor," she said. Eleanor looked up. "That conversation we had," Margaret said. "In the kitchen, 2 weeks ago." Eleanor looked at her. Margaret glanced toward the door through which Nathaniel had just left. "He looked at you when you walked in just now," she said quietly. "The way I described." Eleanor said nothing. "I'm not asking for details," Margaret said. "I'm just telling you that I saw it, and I wanted you to know that I saw it." Eleanor looked down at her plate. "We talked," she said, "this morning, in Laramie. And I asked him for time," she said. Margaret smiled. It was a real smile, the warm, uncomplicated one. "Good," she said. "That's exactly the right answer." The days that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's time at Iron Creek, because they were the first days that were not defined by urgency. The crisis had resolved. The financial threat was neutralized. Aldridge was in Laramie answering to the territorial marshal. The Henderson loan was under review. Hatch had flagged it in the records, and a territorial judge had issued a temporary order preventing any enforcement action while the investigation proceeded. Margaret's property was safe. The work of Iron Creek went on. Cattle, fences, supply schedules. The ordinary business of a working ranch in the Wyoming Territory. And Eleanor went on doing what she had been doing, because the work was real and the ranch still needed it, and she had discovered, genuinely satisfied by it in a way that she had not known to expect. But underneath the ordinary, something was shifting. She and Nathaniel were careful with each other in the particular way of two people who have said something true and are not sure yet what the true thing is going to require of them. They worked together the same way they always had, efficiently, with mutual respect, in the language of numbers and decisions and problems solved. But there were moments that were different. The evening he came into the workspace and found her working past 9, and sat down without speaking and simply stayed, reading through the week's supply receipts that she'd set aside for his review. Just being present in the same room was one of those moments. She had not asked him to stay. He had not announced that he was staying. He had simply stayed, and the quality of the silence between them was not the silence of two colleagues at the end of a workday. It was something warmer and more deliberate than that. The morning she caught her boot on the porch step and stumbled. Not fell, just stumbled, caught herself on the railing. And Nathaniel, who had been 10 feet away, covered the distance in 2 steps and put his hand on her arm, and then did not immediately remove it. That was one of those moments too. Small things. Accumulating. She noticed, in those days, the particular way he listened when she spoke. Not just the content, but the whole of it. The way she thought. The path her reasoning took. He had always listened this way, from the first day in his office. But she understood it differently now. He was not listening the way a man listens to a useful employee. He was listening the way a man listens when the person speaking is the most interesting thing in his vicinity. She found this terrifying. She found it, underneath the terror, something else. On a Wednesday evening, 12 days after the night of the raid, Margaret came for supper, and they all sat together. Nathaniel, Eleanor, Margaret, Samuel, Rodrigo, in the way that had become natural over the weeks. The boundaries between the formal and the personal having dissolved somewhere along the way into something that simply was what it was. After supper, Margaret and Samuel got into a comfortable disagreement about the best route from Laramie to the northern pastures, which was clearly an old disagreement with established positions on both sides, and it occupied the table for 20 minutes in the way of conversations that are really about enjoying the arguing rather than resolving anything. Nathaniel leaned toward Eleanor. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "Just that." She looked at him. She said, "Yes." They walked out to the fence at the edge of the yard. It was a cool evening, the sky doing what Wyoming skies do, the vast, indifferent performance of a landscape that does not scale itself to human concerns. They stood at the fence. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard from Hatch today." "About the investigation?" she said. "About Aldridge," he said. "And Rourke. The territorial marshal has enough to charge both of them. The records were thorough. Apparently Aldridge kept detailed documentation of everything, which Hatch said is common in this type of operation. Men who think their position is secure get careless about records. Because they don't expect to be caught," Eleanor said. "They never do," he said, "until someone looks at the numbers." She looked at the sky. "The Henderson loan will be voided," he continued. "So will the 2 previous acquisitions. The former owners are being notified. The territorial court will work out the property questions." He paused. "It's going to take time, but it's going to be resolved." "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I also talked to a lawyer in Laramie today," he said, "about the loan documentation, and about the dispute filing." She glanced at him. "He said," Nathaniel said slowly, "that the dispute filing was one of the most precisely constructed legal documents he had seen from a non-attorney in his 20 years of practice." Eleanor looked back at the sky. "I had good source material," she said. "The clause gave us the grounds. I just argued them clearly." "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I am trying," he said. to tell you that you are remarkable. And I find that you deflect every time I try." She held his gaze. "I deflect," she said carefully, "because I have spent a long time in rooms where what I could do was the only thing that made me acceptable. And I am, not yet entirely comfortable, with the idea that someone is saying, 'I am remarkable,' and not immediately following it with a list of what that capability is useful for." He was still. He was looking at her with the full weight of that attention. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" he said. No, she said. "That is what I'm afraid of." A pause. "Those are different things," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to face her fully. "Let me be plain," he said. "I am not an eloquent man. I don't have the kind of language that wraps things in the right order. But I know what I know." He paused. "I know that this ranch is better because you came. I know that the people on it are safer because you came. I know that Ed Henderson is still standing on his father's land because of what you did, and Margaret is still on her 40 acres, and that is real, and it matters." He stopped. "And I also know that none of that is why I stood at this fence tonight and asked you to walk with me. Those are separate things, Eleanor, separate." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost him to say that. A man who spoke in economies, who measured his words the way she measured numbers, spending them precisely and without waste. She understood the weight of what it meant when a person like that chose to spend more words than they had to. "I believe you," she said. Something in his face eased. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "I just want you to know what's true," he said. "So that whatever you decide, you're deciding it knowing." Eleanor looked at the fence post in front of her. She looked at her hands. She thought about the 23 days on the road. She thought about the 50 cents and the broken trunk latch and the moment she had stood in the dust outside this ranch with nowhere to go back to and had asked a man she had never met what problems his ranch actually had. She thought about her father and the surgeon's kit. Every tool in its place. None of them wasted. She looked at Nathaniel. "I crossed 1,100 miles," she said slowly, "on a letter that wasn't meant for me. For a job that didn't exist. And in 5 weeks I have found more than I have found anywhere else in 25 years. He waited. "I don't know what to call what I'm deciding," she said. "I'm not used to deciding things like this. I'm used to deciding things that have numbers attached to them." "This doesn't have numbers," he said. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "Ask me again," she said. "In a week, when I've had time to be sure of what I already know." He nodded. Slowly, thoughtfully, without disappointment. "A week," he said. "A week," she confirmed. He looked at her for one more moment, and in the last light of the evening, she could see everything in his face that he had been carrying for weeks without naming. And it was not complicated, which was the thing about Nathaniel Carter that she had come to trust most, above all the other things. He was not a complicated man. He was a thorough one. And what he was carrying was simply, plainly, the particular weight of a person who has found something they did not know they were looking for and is trying very hard not to lose it. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. He walked back to the house. She stood at the fence alone for a little while longer, listening to the sound of the Wyoming night, and inside her chest something that had been held in a specific, careful posture for a very long time. Slowly, finally, began to ease. She was not fixed. She was not unafraid. But she was standing on solid ground, the real kind, the kind that holds. And she had built enough of that in the past 5 weeks to know what it felt like. She turned and walked back toward the warm light of the house. 1 week, she thought. 1 week to be sure of what she already knew. She was already sure. She just needed 7 days to let herself be. The week passed the way significant weeks do, both faster and slower than ordinary time, each day carrying its own particular weight. Eleanor worked. That was what she did when she needed to think, and she needed to think, so she worked. She finished the 6-month financial improvement plan for Iron Creek and presented it to Nathaniel on Thursday morning in the same workspace where she had spent her first nights at the ranch, surrounded by the same ledgers and notebooks that had been her first real proof that she belonged here. He read it the way he always read her work, thoroughly, without rushing, with the focused attention that she had come to understand as one of the most consistent forms of respect she had ever been shown. He looked up when he finished. "This takes the ranch through spring," he said. "Through spring and into summer," she said. "If the fall auction prices hold where they've been trending, the Meridian loan can be reduced by 40% before the original due date. That changes the entire risk profile." "And after summer?" She looked at him. "I haven't written past summer yet." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. He set the report down. He picked up his coffee. "All right." He did not push. He never pushed. It was one of the things about him that she had catalogued carefully over 5 weeks, because she had spent enough time around men who pushed to understand what it meant when one didn't. Margaret came on Friday with 2 pies, and the news that Hatch had formally arrested Rourke in Cheyenne, the second name from the young man's testimony, the one who had managed the enforcement side of Aldridge's operation. He had been found at a hotel 2 days after the raid on Iron Creek, apparently under the impression that things had gone according to plan and that he had time to wait for word. He had been wrong about that. "Aldridge is cooperating," Margaret said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. According to what Hatch told Ed Henderson, Aldridge started talking the morning after Hatch took his records. Men like him always do when the paper is already against them. "Because the paper was built to protect him as long as he controlled it," Eleanor said. "Once he didn't control it anymore, it became evidence instead of armor." "Poetic," Margaret said. "Accurate," Eleanor said. Margaret smiled. She looked at Eleanor with the directness that was her most consistent quality. "How are you?" she said. Not about the case, not about the ranch, about Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her coffee. "I'm going to talk to him tomorrow," she said. Margaret set down her cup. "Tomorrow," she said. "The week is up tomorrow," Eleanor said. "I said a week." "I know what you said." Margaret paused. "And do you know what you're going to tell him?" Eleanor looked up. "Yes," she said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Eleanor's the same way she had the morning after the raid, briefly, warmly, without ceremony. "Good," she said. "It's about time." Saturday arrived with the kind of clear, cold Wyoming morning that made the world feel very large and very specific at the same time. Eleanor was up before 5. She helped Rodrigo with breakfast. She ate. She sat in the workspace for an hour, not doing anything useful, which was an experience so foreign to her that she sat with it deliberately, the way her father had sometimes sat with a problem that was not yet ready to be solved. At 9 o'clock she walked to the barn where she knew Nathaniel would be working. He was doing something with a piece of tack, the same work she had seen Samuel doing the morning Margaret had arrived with the news about Aldridge's men, and he looked up when he heard her come in. He set the tack down. He looked at her face, and he read it immediately, the way he had learned to read her, and she saw something in him go very still. "The week is up," she said. "It is," he said. She stood in the entrance of the barn, and he stood 10 feet from her, and the distance between them felt very precise. "I've been thinking about something you said," she began. "In Laramie, at breakfast." He waited. "You said you wanted the chance to be right," she said. "About this. About me." She paused. "And I told you that you already had it." "You did," he said. "I meant it then," she said. "I mean it now. But I want to say something else. Something I should have said then." He did not move. "I came here broken in some specific ways," she said. "Ways that I had gotten very skilled at not showing. And in 5 weeks at this ranch, I have been seen more clearly than I was seen in 25 years in Boston. Not by everyone, but by enough people that I have had to stop arguing with the evidence." She looked at him directly. "You are part of that evidence, Nathaniel." He crossed the 10 feet between them in 3 steps and stopped close enough that she could see every detail of his face, the weathered lines around his eyes, the particular quality of his attention when it was fully concentrated on one thing. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was low and certain. "I'm not finished," she said. He stopped. She almost smiled. "I'm not finished," she said again, more gently. "I need to say this whole." He nodded once. "I know what I am," she said. "I know how I'm built, and I know what the world has decided that means, and I know I am not what most men imagine when they imagine this." She gestured briefly at the space between them. "I know all of that, and I have spent a very long time deciding that the intelligent response was to want at a safe distance from actually having." She held his gaze. "You are asking me to stop doing that, and I am going to need you to understand what you're asking." "I understand it," he said. "Because if I stop," she said, "and it turns out to be—" "It won't," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said. "I don't. But Eleanor, you are the woman who walked into a barn at 2 in the morning after a raid and got a written confession out of a frightened 20-year-old. You are the woman who found the 11% and held it against Aldridge's best lawyers. You are the woman who sat across from me on the first day and told me my own ranch was in trouble before I had offered you so much as a chair." He stopped. He looked at her with everything plain and visible on his face. "I know what I'm asking, and I know who I'm asking it of, and I am not a man who asks things he hasn't thought through." She believed him. That was the thing. Standing in the barn with the Wyoming morning coming in cold and sharp through the open door, she believed him, completely, in the way she believed clean numbers and solid evidence, because he was both of those things. He had been both of those things from the first morning in his office, and in 5 weeks she had not found a single inconsistency. She looked at him. "All right," she said. He looked at her carefully. "All right meaning?" "All right meaning yes," she said. "All right meaning I am done arguing with the evidence." She paused. "And all right meaning I am still going to need time and patience, and you are going to have to—" He closed the last foot of distance between them and took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, quietly, thoroughly, without performance. She stopped talking. They stood there in the entrance of the barn for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I've got time." She looked at his hand around hers. She thought about the 23 days on the road, the broken trunk latch, the 50 cents, the letter that had gone to the wrong person at the wrong address and deposited her, through a chain of accidents so improbable they might have been designed, in front of a ranch that needed exactly what she had to offer. She thought about her father's watch in her coat pocket, ticking the same way it had always ticked, patient, steady, unmoved by circumstance. She thought, so this is what it feels like to be right about something that has nothing to do with numbers. "Good," she said. He did not let go of her hand. She did not ask him to. The news that Nathaniel Carter and Eleanor Whitmore were keeping company reached the surrounding territory by the following Tuesday, which was faster than Eleanor had expected, but not faster than Margaret had predicted. Margaret had predicted Monday. The reaction was not uniformly warm. There were people in the territory, the same people who had always had opinions about Eleanor, who had watched from a distance and decided what they knew before they knew anything, who said things. The particular flavor of thing that certain people say when a situation develops in a way they consider improbable or unfitting. Eleanor heard some of it directly, and more of it secondhand, through the reliable pipeline that was Rodrigo, who reported these things with the same impassive efficiency he brought to everything and who had, she suspected, his own opinions about the people making the comments. On a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the barn, she went into town for supplies. She went alone. Nathaniel had offered to come, and she had declined, not out of stubbornness, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that there was a kind of confrontation best navigated independently, the kind that told you something about where you actually stood. The dry goods store was run by a man named Watts, who had always been professionally courteous to Eleanor in the way of a man who is courteous to everyone's money, regardless of the person attached to it. He was courteous today. It was in the street outside the store that the first thing happened. A woman named Dutton. She had a husband who ranched 20 miles east, and she had been, from the beginning, one of the whisper contributors in the territory's informal opinion network, was walking past when she saw Eleanor coming out of the store with her supply order. Mrs. Dutton stopped. She looked at Eleanor with the expression of a woman preparing to say something she had been rehearsing. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I have to say, people are talking, and I think someone ought to tell you plainly. A man like Nathaniel Carter, with what he has, it's not. I mean to say that people wonder what the actual arrangement is." Eleanor set her supply crate down on the step. She looked at Mrs. Dutton. Mrs. Dutton had a kind face underneath the performance of the moment. Eleanor could see it. She had the face of a woman who had probably been told, at some point in her life, that the way to manage anxiety about the world was to organize it into categories, and that Eleanor's existence in the category she had been assigned was making the organization difficult. Eleanor understood that. She had spent 25 years being difficult to categorize. "Mrs. Dutton," she said, "I appreciate plain speech, so I'll offer you some in return." She kept her voice level. Not cold, not warm, simply clear. "The arrangement, as you put it, is that Nathaniel Carter is a man of considerable judgment. He has applied that judgment to his finances, his ranch, his community, and his choice of my company. I would suggest that his judgment in all of those matters has proven itself rather thoroughly over the past several weeks, and I would leave the evaluation of his personal decisions to the man who made them." Mrs. Dutton's prepared expression had faltered somewhere in the middle of that. "I don't mean any offense," she said, less certainly than before. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's the kindest thing I can say about it." She picked up her crate. "Good day, Mrs. Dutton." She walked to where her horse was tied and loaded the supplies and rode back to Iron Creek. She was not shaking. She had expected to be shaking. She had braced for the particular internal quaking that had always accompanied these moments in Boston. The moments of direct confrontation with the version of herself that other people had decided was accurate. She was not shaking. She thought about that the whole ride back. She thought about what it meant that she had said what she'd said, and felt not diminished by the exchange, but steady. Exactly as large as she was. No more apologetic and no more defensive than the situation required. She thought, something has changed. Not in the world. The world was the same. Mrs. Dutton would still have her opinions, and they would still move through the territory's informal networks, and they would still occasionally arrive at Eleanor's ears. But something in Eleanor had changed. She pulled through the gate at Iron Creek, and Nathaniel was at the fence, the way he sometimes was in the late morning when he came back from checking the north pasture. He looked up when she rode in. He looked at her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing significant," she said. Mrs. Dutton had some observations. He was still. "What did you say to her?" he said. "I told her your judgment had proven itself thoroughly, and she should leave the evaluation of your personal decisions to you." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you feel?" he said. She considered that. "Fine," she said. And then, surprised by the accuracy of it, "Actually fine. Not performing fine. Actually." Something moved in his face. "Good," he said. "It surprised me too," she said. He walked over and took the supply crate from the horse's saddlebag without being asked, and she let him, and they walked together to the house. October arrived, and with it the fall cattle auction. Ed Henderson brought 18 head to market, 19 in the end, because the 2 late calves had developed right after all. The prices were strong, stronger than the previous spring, which Eleanor attributed to regional supply conditions she had been watching in the supply correspondence for several weeks. She had quietly advised Ed to hold for the second day of auction rather than selling on the first, which was a judgment call that required reading the room as much as reading the numbers. Ed held. The second day prices were better by 11%. When Ed came back and told her that, 11%, the same number that had appeared in the meridian calculation. He said it with the grin of a man who has started to believe that numbers might not be his enemy. "You knew," he said. "I thought it was likely," she said. "There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing," he said. The proceeds, applied directly to principal, dropped the Henderson debt-to-asset ratio below the threshold by a comfortable margin. The Meridian loan itself was under review by the territorial court as part of the broader investigation. Hatch had flagged all 4 properties. But the reduction in the ratio meant that even in the worst case, even if the court proceedings took longer than expected, the Hendersons could not be legally forced to default. They were safe. Ed Henderson shook Eleanor's hand when she told him the final calculation. He shook it the way he had that first night, with the grip of a man who has no language for eloquence and knows that honest is better than elegant. "My father's land," he said. "Your father's land," she confirmed. He nodded. He could not say more than that. She did not require him to. Clara Henderson cried, briefly, at the kitchen table, with her hands over her face and her shoulders shaking. Then she straightened up and wiped her face with the practicality of a woman who allows herself exactly the amount of emotion the moment demands, and not one fraction more. "I'm going to make you a pie," she told Eleanor. "Any kind you want. Don't tell me that's not necessary. It is necessary." "Apple," Eleanor said. "Apple it is," Clara said. November came in cold and decided. The barn wall repair had been completed in October, ahead of the first hard freeze, by a contractor Eleanor had sourced from her supply correspondence, a man out of Cheyenne who did good work at a fair price, and who did not blink when the woman managing the contract turned out to be the same woman who had negotiated the terms. The east wall was solid now. The barn stood the first freeze without complaint. The Meridian investigation concluded its preliminary phase in the second week of November. Aldridge and Rourke were formally charged under territorial law with a list of offenses that Hatch described to Nathaniel as thorough. The 2 previous ranching families whose properties had been taken were in the process of legal recovery. A slow process, the lawyer in Laramie had warned, but a real one. The shell companies were being unwound. Margaret's 40 acres had never been safer. On a Thursday evening in the middle of November, Nathaniel came into the workspace. Eleanor was at the table, writing. She had been working on a supply schedule for the winter months. The kind of detailed, forward-looking planning that she had discovered was her strongest contribution to the ranch's stability, more valuable even than the crisis management, because it prevented crises from having the conditions they needed to form. She looked up when he came in. He was holding something. It was a small object. She could not see it clearly until he came to the table and set it down in front of her. She looked at it. It was a ring. Simple gold band, unornamented, with the kind of honest plainness that matched everything else about him. She looked at it. She looked at him. He had pulled the other chair around to her side of the table instead of sitting across from her, which was different from how they usually sat, and he was close enough that she could see the specific quality of deliberateness in his face. He had been planning this. He had been thinking about it the way he thought about everything, methodically, without rushing, with complete attention. He did not get down on one knee. She was glad of that. It would have been a performance, and he was not a man of performances. He sat beside her. He looked at her. "I told you," he said, "that I was not asking you to decide anything the night we stood at the fence. I said I just wanted you to know what was true." He paused. "I'm asking you now." She looked at the ring on the table between them. She looked at his face. She thought about the morning she had arrived. The dust and the broken trunk and the 50 cents and the words, "the position you came for," never existed. She thought about how she had stood in that moment and decided that the only move available was forward, and had walked into his office, and had looked at the ledger on his desk and seen the numbers that were wrong and said so. She thought about what it had cost her, every year for 25 years, to walk into rooms where the first thing people did was decide she was less than she was. She thought about the price of that, paid in small daily installments over a long time, and how she had managed it by being useful, being competent, being the person with the answers, because answers were a currency that people could not deny even when they wanted to deny everything else. She thought about standing at the fence the night he had said, "Everything is better because you're in it, not just the books, not just the finances, everything," and the way that had landed, and how she had felt, underneath the fear of believing it, the particular quality of something that has been true for a long time, finally being said out loud. She thought about her father's watch. She reached into her coat pocket and held it in her hand for a moment. The weight of it was familiar in the way of things that have been carried long enough to become part of the carrying. She set it on the table beside the ring. She looked at both of them. Then she looked at Nathaniel. "There are people in this territory," she said, "who are going to have opinions about this for a very long time." "Yes," he said, "there are. And you understand what you're asking," she said. "Not in the abstract, specifically. A woman built the way I am built, from Boston, who arrived on a mistaken letter and stayed because she made herself useful. That is the story people are going to tell." "That is the story people who don't know you are going to tell," he said. "People who know you are going to tell a different one." "And you don't mind the first group?" He looked at her steadily. "Eleanor," he said, "I spent 4 years running this ranch and doing it well enough and feeling nothing in particular about it beyond the work. And then you walked into my office with road dust on your coat and a broken trunk latch, and you told me my own ledger was wrong before I offered you a chair." He paused. "I have not felt nothing in particular since that morning, and I am 42 years old, and I have learned enough about my own nature to know that nothing in particular is not what I want the rest of my life to be." He picked up the ring from the table. He held it out to her. "So no, I don't mind the first group." Eleanor looked at the ring in his hand. She thought, "Every problem has a point where it can be corrected cheaply, and a point where it can only be corrected expensively, and then a point where it cannot be corrected at all." She had been living at the expensive point for 25 years, paying the cost of choosing safety over possibility, day by day, in the small sustained currency of a life kept carefully within what she believed she was allowed to want. She was tired of the expensive point. She reached out and took the ring from his hand. She held it for a moment. Then she held out her hand. He put it on. It fit. She looked at it on her finger. She said, "Yes." He covered her hand with both of his. He held it the same way he held everything. Quietly, thoroughly, without performance or excess. Just completely. Just as though it was the most natural thing in the world, which was, she thought, exactly the right way to hold something you intended to keep. "Yes," she said again, because it felt right to say it twice. Because she had been saying no, to possibility, to expectation, to the full weight of her own wanting, for so long that yes deserved to be said at least twice in the same breath. They sat at the table in the workspace with the winter coming hard against the walls of Iron Creek Ranch and a lamp burning between them and her father's watch and his ring in the same small patch of table space, and neither of them needing to say anything else for a while. It was Margaret who cried when she heard. She arrived the next morning. She always seemed to arrive when she was needed, which Eleanor had stopped being surprised by, and Nathaniel told her simply that Eleanor had agreed to marry him, and Margaret put both hands over her mouth for approximately 4 seconds and then took them down and said, "Finally," with such conviction that Nathaniel laughed, which was a sound Eleanor had still not heard often enough to take for granted. Samuel shook Nathaniel's hand for a long time and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite an apology for the mistaken letter, but contained everything an apology would have contained. "I think," he said, "that letter may have gone to exactly the right address." Eleanor looked at him. "It may have," she said. Rodrigo made a cake. He did not announce that he was making a cake. He simply made one and set it on the kitchen table that evening and sat down and said nothing, and the cake said everything. Ed Henderson shook Eleanor's hand, again, with both of his. Clara was already planning the wedding supper and was not accepting objections. The younger Henderson girl, the one who had held the cloth doll on the night she arrived at Iron Creek frightened, came to Eleanor 2 days later with a drawing she had done. A woman on a horse, slightly inaccurate anatomically, but recognizable by the careful attention to the figure's round, full shape, and the absolute confidence in the woman's posture. "That's you," the girl said. "Going to Laramie, to fix things." Eleanor looked at the drawing. She felt something in her chest that was too large to name and too specific to generalize. "Thank you," she said. She kept the drawing. She put it on the workspace table where she could see it while she worked. Winter settled over Wyoming territory with the particular authority of winters that do not negotiate. Iron Creek Ranch held. The repairs held. The finances held. The people inside the walls of it moved through the cold, with the ordinary daily competence of people who know their work, and know their place, and trust the ground they're standing on. Eleanor worked. She managed the accounts and the supply schedules and the vendor negotiations, and the correspondence, and the thousand small decisions that kept an operation the size of Iron Creek functioning at the level it needed to function. She did this because the work was real, and she was good at it, and it mattered. Not because it was the only thing that justified her presence. Not because she was afraid of what happened if she stopped being useful. She did it because she had made herself a home here. Because this was the place she had built. Not found, but built. With her own hands, and her own mind, and her own particular, stubborn, uncategorizable self. And she intended to keep building it for as long as she was able. Nathaniel was beside her. Not behind her, managing her. Not in front of her, leading her somewhere she had not chosen to go. Beside her, the way two people stand when they have decided, with full information and clear eyes, that the territory ahead is better navigated together. She thought sometimes about the letter, about the extraordinary, improbable chain of misdirection that had sent Samuel's letter for the Hendersons to a boarding house in Boston, where a woman named Eleanor Whitmore was in the specific and particular desperation of having lost everything and needing somewhere to go. She thought about what the odds were. She thought about it the way she thought about numbers, looking for the logic underneath, the pattern that explained it. She never found the pattern. She decided, eventually, that some things do not have a numerical explanation, that some things are simply what they are, and the right response is not to calculate them, but to be present inside them completely. She was present. She was completely, wholly, unguardedly present. And on a cold December morning, standing in the kitchen of Iron Creek Ranch, with her husband's coffee poured and ready on the table, and the winter pressing clean and bright against the windows, and her father's watch in her pocket, and a ring on her finger, and the accounts balanced, and the barn standing solid, and Margaret coming for supper, and a drawing on her workspace table of a round, confident woman on a horse going to fix things. Eleanor Whitmore, who had crossed 1,100 miles for a job that never existed, understood with the clarity of her best arithmetic that she had not arrived here to find something. She had arrived here to build something. And she had built it. Every piece, every number, every hard mile of it. She had built it, and it was hers, and it was real. And no one, not Aldridge, not Mrs. Dutton, not the long, expensive accumulation of years that had told her she was less than she was. No one was ever going to take it from her. This was her life. She had made it. She was keeping it. You call viết lại phần hook, đúng nội dung câu chuyện và phải khác các câu chuyện khác. Đây là phần hook viết lại, bám sát đúng nội dung câu chuyện này. Eleanor Whitmore slammed the letter against Samuel Brooks's chest so hard, the old foreman stumbled backward into the porch railing of Iron Creek Ranch. 23 days on the road. Every cent she had spent. Every mile across a continent she had never crossed before. Alone, heavy with exhaustion, and with everything the world had ever said about a woman built the way she was built. And now this man was standing in front of her, telling her the job had never existed. "Read it," she said. Her voice did not shake. "Read every single word you wrote to me." Samuel's face went the color of old ash. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I can explain. You sent this letter to Boston," she said. "I sold my father's books to buy the stage ticket. I survived a coach accident in the middle of nowhere. I arrived here with 50 cents in my purse and a broken trunk, and you are going to stand there and tell me—" "The letter," Samuel said miserably, "was meant for a family in Laramie. The addresses got mixed up. The position. It's not here. It never was here." Eleanor stood absolutely still. She looked at the ranch behind him, the cattle on the slope, the smoke from the chimney of the main house, the barn, the fences, the whole of Iron Creek spread out around her like a world that had no place for her in it. She looked at the road she had come from. She had 50 cents. The stage was gone. Boston was 1,100 miles behind her. There was nowhere to go back to. She looked at Samuel Brooks. "Where," she said quietly, "is the man who owns this ranch?" That was the moment everything began. Not ended, not collapsed. began. Because Eleanor Whitmore had not crossed 1,100 miles and lost everything she had to turn around in the dust of a Wyoming ranch and go back to a city that had already decided who she was. She was going to walk through that door. And nothing. Not a mistaken letter. Not a man who hadn't hired her. Not a territory full of people who would look at her full, heavy figure and decide in the first 2 seconds what she was worth. Nothing was going to stop her from building something on the other side of it. This is her story. Stay with me until the very last word. Because I promise you, it goes places you do not expect. If you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And drop the name of your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see exactly how far Eleanor's story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning.